It was one of the many estates in one of the cities of this world. A girl came to the main door of this manor and stomped her foot tiredly. The girl exhaled a sigh of relief and thought that meant here was the destination of her long journey. The girl had long red hair and big blue eyes. She clutched the straps of her rucksack nervously. The protagonist of this story was known to Jerry. She remembered her mother telling her one last thing on her deathbed. Jerry tearfully asked her mother not to say that. The mother told her daughter that her money for medicines had run out. The girl claimed that she could save more. The woman knew it would take too long. She asked her daughter to open the box she pointed to with her eyes. When Jerry opened the box, her mother told her that the item had been left to her by the girl's own father. She wanted her daughter to take it and find him. Her father was a noble knight and has the same red hair. Her mother had told the girl that her father was a good man and therefore would not shun her. Jerry just wanted to go into the manor, show her ID, and take the money. The girl clenched her fists encouragingly and told herself she could handle anything. But her confidence was low, for it was a little embarrassing to turn up like this and introduce herself as her daughter. But there was no money left for her mother's medicine. Besides, there were 4 of the younger ones waiting for Jerry at home. She hoped she wouldn't get kicked out for such an unexpected visit and promised herself to think of something. The girl made a plan of what to do if you were the bastard child of an aristocrat, and the first was to walk through the main door. The second point in this plan was to show ID, which confirmed that you were the child of an aristocrat. The third item included signing the disinheritance document and receiving a silence fee. Afterwards, the girl planned to joyfully return to Lolololala with a bag of gold. The plan was simple enough, but something still bothered Jerry and made her frown. She had heard that it was now possible to get a reward if you simply renounced the inheritance. To the nobility, it was just pennies, but to a commoner like her, it was a means of survival. Jerry cheered herself up. Making up her mind, the girl approached the main gate to the entrance of the manor, at which a guard stood. Jerry smiled and said hello to the man, but the girl felt shaky. The guard looked at the girl in bewilderment at first and said nothing, studying the approaching woman intently. Seeing no danger in her, the man smiled and waved his hand in greeting. The girl was glad that at least the guards here were friendly. The man informed her that maid recruitment was now closed. But Jerry explained that she didn't then. She asked if he happened to know a man named F, and the guard said it was the first time he'd heard of him. She realized that apparently no aristocrat would give his real name to a woman he had met only a few times in the city. The guard asked if someone had played a joke on her by pretending to be an aristocrat. The man asked if she had come to look for her father. Jerry was glad, for the guard had understood everything at once. She encouraged herself that the dialogue would be a good one. The girl pulled out a golden ID card and asked if the guard had ever seen it before. The guard's eyes bulged in surprise. The guard asked her to stay there and not to go anywhere because she had a gold ID. The man himself ran deeper into the manor. Jerry exhaled a sigh of relief and thought that judging by the guard's reaction, the ID wasn't fake, and the aristocrat could have given any name he wanted. The guard brought in a man that cried out in surprise when he saw the ID card held out to him. The man approached, convinced by the guard's words. Jerry looked at him carefully, for it was the first time she had seen a nobleman. The man said that since he was just a servant of the manor, he could not solve the girl's question and asked her to wait. Jerry was surprised that he was not an aristocrat. The girl looked in surprise at the back of the departing servant of this manor and didn't know what it all meant. The guard called the girl miss and asked her to wait a little longer. Jerry was surprised to be addressed in such a respectful manner. Jerry thought confusedly that she could certainly wait, but she had thought earlier that she would quickly take the money and go back. She didn't understand what was going on here. A while later, the girl stood in the middle of one of the best rooms of the manor she had approached. She stood tensely, for she dared not sit down, and asked herself what was going on and why she was there. The servants reported that they had prepared tea for her. There were also a lot of goodies for tea on the table. Jerry hesitated to say thank you. She was horrified to realize that she couldn't even move, for she was very uncomfortable being there. Jerry wondered if she really had a right to be there. She was worried that if she sat down on the chair, she would stain the trim. The girl naively assumed that the meeting wouldn't be long, but it turned out to be a little more complicated than that. The servant summoned the valet, who informed her with a respectful bow that he could not decide her question. After him, the butler came and told her that she had to meet her master. He said he would take her to the guest room. It was unlikely they knew she existed, so she was puzzled as to what had brought her there. Suddenly, a new man entered the room and apologized. Jerry was startled to think that she was now looking at a real aristocrat. The man asked her if she had brought her ID. The girl bowed and greeted the man who entered. The man stopped her and asked her to sit down. The man smiled sincerely at the girl and asked her name, placing a cup of tea in front of her. The girl sat tensely on the sofa and answered the gentleman that her name was Jericho Hans. The man replied that it was a pleasure to meet her and asked for her ID. Jerry looked at him hopefully and wondered if it was really the owner of the manor and her father. The girl respectfully held out her gold ID card to the man with both hands. She hoped he wouldn't chase her out of there without giving her a coin. The man started asking her about her mom. The girl told him that before her marriage, her mom's name had been Jonah Xifen, and after that, Jonah Hans. She said that she was now 17 years old. The gentleman jumped up from the sofa and clung to the girl, saying that everything fit together and it was definitely her. The girl was shocked by the aristocrat's behavior. When the man let go of the girl, she clenched her fist tightly and thought that he was her father after all. Jerry decided to clarify whether her conclusions were correct, but the man took her by the shoulders and told her that he was not her father. He was very pleased. He turned round and waved to the girl and ordered her to follow him. Jerry was confused by what was happening. Jerry stomped after the gentleman and excitedly asked what he was about. The man replied that they were going to meet the girl's birth father. The gentleman kept hurrying the girl for some unknown reason. They entered one of the rooms of the manor and the girl froze when she saw a magical teleporter in it. The man asked the employees when the teleporter would be ready. They said it would be another 20 minutes before it was at full power. Jerry knew that every estate in their empire had one. It takes a colossal amount of money and magic to set up a teleporter. In the past, using teleporters was considered a serious crime. The girl was in hysterics. She couldn't believe this wasn't a dream. If this was reality, then her use of the teleport was unthinkable. The master asked the maids to dress the shocked girl up properly in the remaining time. The maids soon jumped up to Jerry. The girls sweetly apologized to the girl and afterwards started twisting and turning her around and around as they pleased. Jericho asked them to stop. When the maid's work was finished, the girl's unruly copse of hair was neatly gathered. She was changed into a long dress of a representative of aristocracy. The maids asked the stunned girl how she liked her appearance. They brought her a mirror so she could look herself over. The girl looked at herself and cried, for she thought that the clothes did not suit her face, which showed that she was from the village. The gentleman walked over and gave the maids a thumbs up, noting that you couldn't fool the blood. Jerry thought he knew exactly who her biological father was. The servants reported that the teleporter was ready for use. The blue light from the portal illuminated the room. The gentleman offered the girl his hand and asked her to come up to him. She couldn't believe that they were really going. Jerry wondered why a bastard child was allowed to use the teleporter. The man asked her not to be afraid and promised to escort her. The girl asked herself why he was in such a hurry without explaining anything to her. The girl hesitantly stepped her foot into the circle of the portal, and something incomprehensible to her began to happen. Jerry screamed with fear. 3 days before the main events, the girl had heard from the man who gave her a lift that red hair like hers was not to be found in the whole neighborhood. But the man remembered that the knight had the same. The man was traveling by wagon towards the town and took Jericho with him. He inquired if the girl was going to her father. She answered him honestly that her mother had told her to find her own father. The man said that red hair was not found on any of the sons of nobles. Jericho replied that she had the precious metal, which would be proof, and if not, she would at least sell it and make money. The man laughed good-naturedly and said that it was a good idea. Such things were much better than some paper. He said that the knight had done well. The man confessed that her father was a great man who had killed monsters and had even attended their village feast. He narrated that if it wasn't for that knight, many people in their village might have suffered. The girl asked him if he was telling the truth. The man replied that it was rare to find such good men as that knight. To the rest of the world, he was known as Mr. Iraf, but to them, the commoners, this man was a knight of freedom. He assured the girl that her father would not turn his back on her. Also, the man revealed that Knight had a good relationship with Yona, and thought the man would take her to be his concubine, and was very surprised when that didn't happen. The girl confessed to him that perhaps she wanted to be reassured, but everyone around her said the knight was a good man. The man said he'd have a treat with Jericho if everything went well. Presently, the girl was squirming on all fours after passing through the portal, and listening to a heated argument between a familiar gentleman and a stranger. They were arguing about how right it was for the man to use the teleporter without permission. The man helped the girl up and asked her not to be so frightened, because she didn't even know who her father was. The girl asked in shock if her father was the emperor. But the man surprised her far more with his answer. He said that her father was a more amazing man than the emperor. The girl could not keep up with the gentleman, who was always walking ahead and pushing her. He kept repeating that they had no time. Sitting in the carriage, the girl thought about the fact that only a couple of days ago she could not have imagined that she would be in for something like this. She asked herself who this more amazing person than the emperor was. The girl remembered how earlier she had approached her stepfather, whom she called father, and struck up a conversation about Uncle Charles from the neighboring village. She held the gold certificate behind her back and told her father that Uncle Charles had found his noble father and was able to buy a piece of land with the proceeds. The man immediately realized what his daughter was talking about and said he knew what Yona had told her. Tears glistened in the girl's eyes. Her father told her that she didn't have to find her real daddy if she didn't want to. The girl threw herself into her kind father's arms and told him that he would always be the only daddy for her. The man stroked her hair and asked her not to talk like that, because if it wasn't for her birth father, she wouldn't have come into this world. He added that without her own father, she wouldn't be his beautiful daughter. He told Jerry to do what her heart told her to do. If anything, the man wasn't going to let them starve. Jerry confessed that it pained her to watch the younger ones try to fill their bellies with potatoes. The excited girl told her father that Uncle Charles had already told her everything. She thought it would all work out. The man said that if she wanted, he would take the day off and go with her. The girl assured him that everything was fine, and he was not allowed to leave the younger ones behind. She had promised her father that she would only be gone for a short time. Sitting in the carriage, the girl bit her lip at her promise. Jericho took the ID in her hands and mentally asked her parents if she could go back. The lord informed the girl that they were on the spot when their carriage stopped at the Duchy of Arrivo. The gentleman told the man who met them that he had urgent business, so he had arrived unannounced. He asked that they be taken immediately to his lordship, the Duke. Jericho stammered and asked the butler where they were. He bowed and said they were in the Duchy of Arrivo. The girl felt as if she had been struck by lightning when she realized that her father was from the house of Arrivo, the house of the knight who had defeated the mad dragon. Jericho began to cry hysterically, for she thought that the gentleman who had brought her there had definitely gone mad. He led the resisting girl inside the house. The girl thought that they weren't the only two people in the world who could have red hair. Even if you imagine for a second that her father is from the house of Arrivo, she's still a bastard. An illegitimate child can't visit such a house through the center doors. She was afraid she'd be killed for it. The girl's heart thundered fearfully. The gentleman stopped near the large doors and informed her that his lordship was behind that door. After that, he knocked and the girl froze in panic. She thought that he was not a good man. After all, if he got her killed, she would never forgive him. When they were allowed to enter, the doors opened with a creak, and the girl saw the two men that were in the room. Jericho had heard that the nobility had never put the commoners in a position of power before. Duke Arrivo was an older man and looked at the girl critically. Jerry tensed and gulped. She had thought she would look like nothing more than a blank slate in the eyes of such a great duke. The man who brought her bowed and said that the master had told him that he had a woman named Yona, to whom he had given a certificate, and he ordered that if her child or she appeared, she should be brought to him at once. An elderly man sat on a chair. He clarified if there was any proof that this girl was Araf's daughter. Jericho answered in the affirmative and with two shaking hands handed the man a gold ID card. The elderly man was completely gray and looked tired. He slowly took the ID card in his hands and studied it quietly. The girl's heart beat anxiously in anticipation. The older man replied that the ID card was definitely Araf's. Jericho flinched at the man's reply. She couldn't believe that her father was really Mr. Araf, the lord who had defeated the mad dragon. Another man in the room started discussing the girl with the older man. The man claimed that the hair color was similar, but whether she was his daughter. They said they were sick of the smell of burning human flesh. Jericho knew she would not be accepted. The older man asked her to come closer, and she obediently complied. He smiled and said she looked like her father. Jericho thanked him in embarrassment. People shouted that it was not certain, and how could his lordship say such a thing? They said that everything had to be checked thoroughly, for they did not know where the girl came from or why. Jericho was very uncomfortable with this reasoning of those present. The elderly man sternly ordered them to stop. He took the girl by the hands and began to cry bitterly. The elderly man said that the girl was definitely Araf's daughter. Jericho noticed that the man didn't look like a sentimental person, but was crying now. The girl couldn't help herself and cried for some reason. Suddenly, the man stood up and said that there was no need to linger and he would take her to her father. Jericho did not expect to see the Duke himself. They walked together through the corridors of the manor. The man asked what the girl knew about her father. She said that her mom had told her he was a free knight with red hair. But speaking of the warrior Araf, the girl replied that he was a man of the great house of Arivo, a swordmaster who defeated a mad dragon and saved many lives. In gratitude, he received from the emperor a new surname, Miweo. Jericho noted with embarrassment that she was only aware of that. She hoped she had said the right thing. The man told her that her father was the youngest son of the previous Duke of Arivo, their father. The girl stared at the older man in shock, for he was her uncle. The older man looked up tiredly and sadly, pausing. He told me that his brother had never cared about the title of Duke. Araf, with his brother's permission, hid his identity and was a free knight. He trained hard and eventually became a master swordsman. Araf then received orders from the emperor himself and killed the dragon, thus becoming the first dragon slayer in the history of mankind. The man added that it was right after Jericho was born. He said that 17 years had passed since that day, and his brother had never married or had children. Jericho still didn't understand, even though he had no children, why her bastard was so welcome in this house. The girl did not notice when they reached the big, beautiful doors. An elderly man called out to her and told her that they had arrived. He asked the girl not to be frightened, for his brother could not move. Jericho stared at the man with a questioning look. She could feel the heavy atmosphere around her. A servant opened the door in front of them with a creak. A heavy odor wafted from behind the open door. It was so concentrated that the girl could smell it at once. Jericho covered her mouth fearfully with her fist. She recognized the smell with horror on her face. An elderly man walked first into the room. The smell was so cloying, as if something had rotted in the room. Jericho followed the man and immediately noticed that the room was drowned in many different colors. But what was quite remarkable and surprising to her was that the room wasn't even ventilated. Jericho had the feeling in this room that a seriously ill person was lying there. She looked around anxiously. The elderly man climbed up the steps where there was a bed on an elevated platform. The girl noticed that the closer to the bed, the stronger the odor. The girl looked out from behind the man's shoulder and saw him lift the white sheet off the bed in one motion. Jericho was horrified to see the corpse of a man. She didn't understand why the corpse was lying there. Suddenly the corpse turned its blue eyes to the people who had come to see it. Jericho froze because of the horror of what she saw. She stared at the corpse with widened eyes and didn't even breathe. The girl realized that it was not a corpse and thought that the man was rotting alive. Her newfound uncle cried and told the rotting man that he was glad, for his daughter had made it before his only brother Araf was laid to rest. The girl looked at the rotting skeleton that still had sparse red hair like hers. The man's blue eyes were the same as the girl's. Jericho realized with horror that it was Mr. Araf. She asked herself what had happened to him that was so terrible. The elderly man tearfully asked his brother if he remembered a woman named Yona, for Jericho was her daughter and his. The girl said anxiously that it was a pleasure to meet you. She said her name but not her surname, thinking it would be disrespectful to use her stepfather's surname. Jericho asked herself over and over again why the man looked like that. Suddenly they heard a creak. He raised his hand. The girl took his hand in hers and told him her mom's name was Yona Zifin, and asked if he remembered her. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. She heard the man's husky voice saying that she was his daughter and that she looked just like her mother. The girl clutched the man's hand tightly in hers at the unexpected words. She hadn't expected that he could speak like that. But she immediately came to her senses and smiled at him. The girl said she was glad he still remembered her mum. The girl was washing her hands in a basin of water after they left her birth father's chambers. Her uncle then told her that it was the poison of the mad dragon. It had consumed her brother's body from the inside out. The man sadly revealed that from the moment Araf defeated the dragon until now, he had been slowly dying. He also told his niece that at times his brother would come round and look for people. He asked if she could stay with him. Jericho agreed. Jericho only asked if he could write a letter to his family first. The man agreed and thanked her. He asked her not to work too hard and went to rest. The girl understood why the nobleman was in such a hurry to bring her, for Araf could die at any moment without seeing his daughter. The girl did not notice that the elderly man's son stayed with her. He asked the girl why she had come. Jericho looked fearfully at the man, who was looking at her with doubt and displeasure. She didn't know what to say. She told him that her mom had been married long ago, and she had no intention of looking for the gentleman, despite having the ID. But her mom had asked Jericho to find him before she died. The man looked at her critically and asked if that meant she wished to find support in their home after her mother's death. The girl was taut as a string from the tension. She stammered and told him that she just wanted to show the Lord that he had a daughter and then return home. Jericho realized that she could not say she had come for the money. The man frowned, for he obviously didn't believe her. He turned round grudgingly and left the girl smiling fearfully at him with the maids. It was the second day after arriving at the estate that Jericho was by Araf's side. Jericho sat by her dying father's bedside all night. The maid came in the morning and noticed that the girl was very tired. She asked Jericho to rest, promising to call her as soon as the gentleman woke up. The maid brought breakfast. Jericho thanked her but said she could manage. The maid asked the girl if she should add some more incense. Jericho assured her that she didn't need to because everything was fine. She couldn't get used to the fact that even the servants were very honorable here. The girl asked not to be called mistress. The maid asked if she could call her lady. The girl scratched her head and asked if she was Mr. Araf's daughter. Could she be called a lady? The maid exclaimed joyfully and enthusiastically that the girl didn't know about something after all. She said that after the Lord defeated the dragon, His Majesty the Emperor granted him the surname Miweo and the title of Duke. But after he killed the mad dragon, he fell ill. So few people know about it. The girl held out her father's name, Duke Mivio, with dazed eyes. The maid said that was it. It was the first time Jericho had heard anything about titles and she wasn't versed in them. The maids left the chambers and said goodbye that they would see the girl at the meal. They told the girl that if she needed anything, she could call her. The girl smiled cheerfully and manically at the maids until the door closed completely behind them. Jericho grasped the door handles and exhaled heavily, bending down. The girl nearly fainted. She had to eat near the patient and stay up all night. It was not very difficult for her physically, but morally it was still a bit hard. She convinced herself that Mr. Araf could come round at any minute, so she should be there for him. After these thoughts, the girl suddenly heard the voice of a dying man calling faintly for her. Jericho quickly walked over to the bed, smiled at the man, and asked if he had come to his senses. The man quickly moved his eyes up and down. The girl concluded that it was probably a sign of agreement. The girl thought that she had been with him for 2 days now, and was beginning to understand him a little. It seemed to her that the man liked to see someone near him after returning to consciousness. Jericho decided to laugh like her mom. She wanted her to be a fond memory in his life too. She asked him what he wanted to talk about today. The girl asked the man if he remembered meeting her mom in the village. She said that she had recently seen the city for the first time, and now she was already there, and it was like a dream. Jericho thought to herself that this dream was not a good one for her. She hoped that she would be able to get the money, though she felt guilty when she thought about the money. The girl decided to say something nice to the man, because he just woke up and she will stop feeling remorse. She pulled a lock of her long hair and showed it to the man. Jericho had told him that no one in their neighborhood had such red hair, so when they saw her, they knew she was Yona's daughter. She could hardly believe it, but her mother had always told her she looked like her father. As it turned out, their hair was the same color. She thought the man smiled at her words. The girl was pleased with the positive reaction and decided to keep talking. She remembered something. Jericho showed the man the ID and said that because of it, the nobleman had gotten her to him quickly. He told her it was made of real gold. The girl wanted to test it to see if it was real. But then she said it was better not to, because it might leave dents. Jericho asked the man about the drawing because everyone recognized it. The man wheezed the word no, and the girl asked him again, for she did not understand. He repeated that it was the written sign of nobility. Jericho stretched in surprise that they appeared to have their own written signs. She wondered if his name was written there. If she could read them, she would have recognized her father's name sooner. She looked at the man with some warmth and noted that he was listening, even though it was hard for him. Jericho bragged that she was very strong and could lift a sack of potatoes. Her mom told her that she got it from her father, and she was right, because her father was a warrior who had slain a dragon. The maid knocked and asked to come in. Jericho allowed her to. The maid came in with a broom and asked the girl to wipe the sword, apologizing for such a request. The girl was surprised, for she did not know that there was a sword there. She asked where it was. The maid took the girl behind her to show her. She said that it was behind the flowers and that it needed to be wiped down. The maid assured her that she was allergic to flowers. The sword was indeed lying on a small table in the thick of flowers that a blooming sea surrounded it. The girl rubbed her head and assured the maid that it was all right, for she would help. After her words, the man called weakly to her. Jerry turned round incomprehensibly and clarified what the man wanted. She didn't have time to get far away from him. So she noticed how he held out a shaking palm and told her not to do it as it was dangerous. The girl repeated to him that she was very strong and would be able to lift the sword easily. She added that she knew how to hold on to the hilt. The maid said that the lady was correct. Jericho walked away confidently towards the sword, though the man repeated the word no over and over again. She didn't understand the reason for it. As she made her way through the flowers, she wondered if he wanted her to touch sharp things. Her father in the village didn't let her touch nails, hammers, or other tools either. The girl was impressed when she saw the sword up close. Even though she didn't know anything about weapons, the sword looked incredibly cool. The girl asked the maid if she was talking about him before taking the sword. The maid answered in the affirmative. Suddenly, the skeleton of a man sat up abruptly on the bed and waved his hand. He shouted no, loudly and longingly. The girl with the sword in her hands shook very hard with fright and fear. She didn't expect such a thing, and the skeleton's movements looked frightening. The skeleton sat like that with his hand outstretched and huge eyes widened with shock, looking at his daughter who held his sword. The maid was also very shocked from both the Lord's reaction and the fact that the girl was holding a sword. She clutched tightly at the broom she had brought with her. The girl came to her senses and thought he had frightened her. She came out of the flowers and wanted to give the sword to the stunned maid. Jerry said the sword was too precious to leave it to dust. Jerry wondered if she could touch Mr. Araf's sword. The maid bowed and apologized to the girl for daring to test her. She asked to be killed. Jerry stared at the maid incomprehensibly. The girl's uncle rattled open the door to the chambers. He shouted angrily that everyone was an idiot, for he had told them that Jericho was Ur's daughter. The man froze in shock when he saw his found niece carrying his legendary brother's sword. He stammered and asked the girl if she had really taken the sword now. Jerry still didn't let go of the sword. The girl asked tensely about the fact that she shouldn't have taken it. The maid fell to her knees in front of Jericho. An elderly man was crying at his younger brother's bedside. He was repeating to Araf that his daughter had raised the sword. Jericho touched his shoulder gently and asked if he was all right. The man through sobs asked his brother if he had seen it, and if not, at least let him hear it. Jericho stood by her uncle. He told the dying man that his daughter Jericho had raised the sword. She had raised the dragon slayer. The girl noticed with alarm that the man was crying even harder than last time. She didn't understand what it all meant. She thought with horror that she might have touched a relic that was not to be touched. But that wasn't fair, for she had just trusted their maid. The older man asked Jericho if she would put the sword next to Araf. The girl agreed to honor the request. A crowd of people crowded at the entrance to the chambers. They watched in shock as the girl held the sword. They awed with every movement she made. Jericho frowned. She wondered why everyone was so surprised by the sword in her hands. The girl carefully placed the sword next to the man's skeleton. She wondered if perhaps in this house a bastard was not allowed to touch such things. Jerry thought that there was nothing to be done and let them think what they wanted. Jericho put her hand over her heart and thought anxiously that she had been in this situation twice already. She was shaking all over. She asked herself to calm down. The Duke had told her that this sword was called a dragon slayer. He told her that it was the sword his brother had used to slay the dragon. Jericho noted that she felt a strange aura from it. The man told her that Araf took great care of this sword. When he was feeling better, he would take care of it himself and dust it off. But in time, the man lost the ability to move, and no one could touch his sword. Jericho asked the reason for this categorization. Her uncle answered her that the dragon slayer had a consciousness of its own. This sword began to possess consciousness after absorbing the blood of a mad dragon. It is the only sword that can do such a thing. Whoever holds it can slay a dragon without even being a sword master. Many have come to them to acquire the sword, pretending to be Araf's children. The Dragon Slayer, however, recognizes only the true descendants of Iraf. All the people who tried to touch the Dragon Slayer were agonizingly burned in the fire. The girl's heart thundered after the man's words, as if jumping out. She was horrified to realize everything that had been said. The man had said that Jericho was the one who had been able to take him. The girl was drawing conclusions. She asked herself if the maid had asked her to bring a sword to kill. Jericho turned sharply to the maid and shouted angrily that this was too much. The maid bowed her head and begged for forgiveness. But the man asked the girl not to blame the maid, for she was suspected by her cousin. Tears came to Jericho's eyes. An elderly man approached the frightened and crying girl and stroked her back. He said that everything was all right now and that he would protect her. The girl quietly thanked him. The girl cried bitterly, hugging herself to her shoulders. She realized that she was indeed the daughter of a dragon slayer. Her uncle had asked her not to cry, to spread her chest, for she was the only daughter of the warrior who had saved humanity. But she was not happy. It was pouring rain. Many people in black were hiding under umbrellas near the entrance to the church. Jericho's father expended his remaining strength in a shout to warn her. The hero let out his last breath. The girl stood over the coffin and cried. She wondered why her father had shouted that she was not allowed to take the sword. Perhaps he didn't believe in their bond, but he didn't want to see Jericho die either. Her uncle told her that those were hard times. He wanted his brother's torment to finally end so he could rest in peace. It appeared the man was waiting for his daughter. Jericho didn't think so, but she remained silent. She thought that even though they'd been together for a few days, she couldn't call this man a father. But she had to show proper respect for the warrior who had saved humanity. Jericho tearfully whispered over the coffin the wish that Mr. Iraf would rest in peace. A lot of people came to say goodbye to the great hero that day, no matter what the weather was like. Jericho frowned at the fact that there was nobility everywhere. It seemed to her that even the emperor was there. The girl's gaze locked onto someone in the crowd of people. Her eyes sparkled with admiration. It was a very beautiful woman with golden hair and wearing rich jewelry. Jericho noticed her beauty at once. Her head even felt refreshed. Jericho bowed to the woman and the man who accompanied her and thanked them for coming. The woman told the girl that she didn't look well. The girl confusedly noticed that the woman had the same hair color as the emperor. The woman must have been from the imperial family. Jerry shifted her gaze to the man standing behind the woman, holding an umbrella. At first, she thought it was not a man but a woman. It was the first time she had ever seen such a snow-white man. The man grudgingly looked the girl straight in the eye. He had unusual red glass eyes. Jericho quickly tilted her head, for she realized that she had been staring at the man for too long. She thanked them again for the visit of honor. The woman and her attendant said nothing more. They walked away melancholically, leaving the girl puzzled. The girl was even a little frightened. She looked at her hair and thought that before she had thought that she would never see a brighter red than her hair. But the man's eyes were like rubies. She stretched out quickly. The girl was so frightened that she forgot why she was there. She had to get ready for the other guests. Jericho was now the funeral director. The next guest, without greeting, immediately handed the girl a purple card with the inscriptions of nobles on it. The woman, smiling, informed Jerry that they were from the Stars Company. Always and everywhere will take care of your life. Jericho thanked the woman and the man who accompanied her for coming. She noticed that the woman was a beauty. The girl took the card and apologized for not being able to hold it with both hands. She mentally marveled, for this was the coolest stars trading company ever. The woman informed her with a smile that it was not a card worth lowering the sword for. She told the girl that they would see each other again. Jericho didn't think she would get the chance to socialize with high-ranking personalities again. The man who arrived with the woman expressed words of condolence for the girl's loss. She didn't immediately notice his beauty because of the color of his hair. It was red. The girl bowed her head and thanked the man for coming. He looked at the sword in Jericho's hands with a quick glance. He asked excitedly if this sword was a dragon slayer. The girl answered in the affirmative. Suddenly the woman hurried the man, for he was detaining other people. The man quickly ran after his mother. Jericho was surprised that it was mother and son. She looked at them shocked, for the woman looked so young. Jerry thought the man was just her bodyguard. She wondered what was this sequence of amazing things. The sun was nearing the horizon. People were leaving. The uncle said he was going to the castle and asked the girl to return with the first star. Jericho was glad that today was the last time she would receive such honored guests. She thought with hope that she would be able to go home. The girl had a lot of things going on during the week. She had a strong feeling that she had traveled the journey of a lifetime. Suddenly, all the people who had stayed until the end heard the hurried stomping of a woman who was running towards the coffin. She shouted loudly that she was not too late. The woman opened the doors in front of her, which the servants were already trying to close. She shouted happily at that. The doors were still open. It was the head of the magic tower. Jericho stared in fascination at the fantastical garment she wore. It was a sort of witch's hat and a star-spangled robe. One of the servants remarked that he thought the head of the magic tower wasn't coming. The woman replied loudly that he just didn't know who she and Araf were to each other. Jerry wondered who she was to her father. Jericho had no idea what the head of the magic tower did, but judging by her escort, she was also an important person. The woman came with a young man in similar attire. The woman was forcing the man to say hello to Jericho. He resisted her actions and asked why him. The woman shouted menacingly that he should show manners. The man called the woman Mum. Jericho thought that the guys in front of her were unusual. She bowed to those who came and thanked them for their visit. The woman asked her tactlessly if she was learning fencing. Jericho hadn't expected such a question, and was surprised to ask what the woman was talking about. The woman asked another question about whether the girl thought she could become a sword master, or maybe she had an aptitude for magic. She asked how Jerry felt about the fact that Araf could move even when poisoned. Questions poured out of the woman's mouth, whether Jerry had felt something when she took the dragon slayer in her hands, or whether her life force or magic had begun to leave her. The woman asked with a mad researcher's gleam in her eyes. The man took the woman under his arms and told her she was overreacting. Jerry didn't realize what kind of verbal storm had just passed through her. The man in the robe walked up to her and bowed without saying anything. Jericho thought this one was definitely the last one. She thanked him for his visit. The man was shaking violently under his robe and mumbled something quietly about his mum. Jericho couldn't make out his words and asked him to repeat himself. Suddenly, the man started shouting loudly at the girl. He was apologizing for his parents. Jericho stared at him in shock. The events that followed shocked the girl no less. The man's mum cracked him with a shout that he had gone mad. Jerry wondered if the man had taken offense at her, which she re-questioned several times. The man pulled the hood of his robe off his head and shouted a question as to why his mother had brought him, for he hadn't slept a wink in a week. Jericho looked at the man with rapt attention. He was very handsome. She thought that if it weren't for the circles under his eyes from lack of sleep, he would be as handsome as a fairy. After his angry words, the man fell to the ground face down right at Jericho's feet. Jericho clarified if he had fallen asleep, as everyone present tensed at this surprise. The man mumbled in his sleep that Jerry was a beautiful girl. Another man in a robe picked up the sleeping man in his arms and apologized loudly, then withdrew with him. Jericho stared perplexed at the fleeing man who was dragging the sleeping young man. As soon as they left, Jerry sat down on the ground with relief, for at last it was all over. The servants asked if the lady was all right. Jericho stopped them with a wave of her hand. She replied that she was fine, she just wanted to sit for a while. She was very tired of standing and bowing all day. She had seen the last hours of Araf's life, even performed the funeral ceremony. Now she could return home in peace. Jerry hoped she would be paid for being the organizer of the ceremony. She planned to tell everyone what had happened when she returned to the village. The young girl naively assumed that everyone would be very surprised at her marvelous adventures. Jericho thought that a week would not be enough time for her to tell everything. The stars had already sprinkled the evening sky. A few days after the funeral, Jerry was in for a surprise. She was informed that she could not return home. This news struck her unpleasantly. She was informed that her home was now here and asked if the girl was missing anything. The maids informed the girl with a smile that if she didn't like Arivo Castle, they would prepare Mivio's residence. Jericho began to shake violently at this news. The maids smiled obligingly, as if they didn't understand the problem. Jerry shouted loudly that she wanted to go home. After the funeral ceremony, the girl went to bed with weakness and fever. She thought sadly that she was young and strong. Fortunately, Jericho had recovered quickly enough and was glowing with health and strength. She didn't think she had any business with the nobility. But that's where the surprise came in. Her cousin told her, with obvious displeasure, to make herself at home. The maids smilingly asked where their mistress was going. They tried to fulfill her every possible wish. Jerry felt as if they didn't want to let her go home. She wished they would just give her money and help her get home. Jericho was throwing tantrums and grabbing her head. She didn't know her way back home, so she couldn't just turn around and go home. She felt she had to take extreme measures because she had no choice. The girl wanted to meet his lordship but was refused. The butler explained that her uncle was not feeling well because of the emotional shock and needed to rest. Jerry was sad to realize that it had not worked out, and her uncle had been her last hope. His lordship was old, so he couldn't recover as quickly as she could. The girl's cousin said affectionately that his father had not yet recovered. He asked her to stay with him. Jerry thought tensely that she couldn't get used to such an affectionate tone. The girl, smiling awkwardly, replied that she just wanted to check on his lordship. The man asked her not to call her his father, for he was her uncle. He asked her not to call him her father, as he was her uncle. Jerry didn't understand how she could call a man older than her father her brother. He asked if she was uncomfortable at their place. Jerry lied that it was fine, because everyone was so hospitable and kind. The man asked her to speak honestly, for they were not strangers. Jericho thought to herself that they had been strangers just a few days before. He was only scaring the girl now. She said she was grateful to be looked after when she was unwell, but she expressed a desire to go home and see her family. The man hummed thoughtfully after her words and said if it was just about family. The next day, the girl shockingly met her entire family in the estate's courtyard. The younger ones hugged their sister with joy and tears. Jerry asked her father how they got here. The man told his daughter that it was for her to tell. He asked if the knight was a famous warrior. One younger sister declared with childish delight that they had traveled there in a big carriage. The brother excitedly stated that the nobles had allocated a cash grant to their and the neighboring village. The youngest asked with enthusiasm and childlike directness if his sister had got rich here and made a fortune. His father awkwardly covered his loud son's mouth and asked Eki to be quieter. The girl's sister asked her quietly if they were really allowed to stay there. The satisfied maid answered in the affirmative and asked them to make themselves at home. The younger ones were excited about the food they were fed and how cool it was there. The little sister was excited about the beautiful dresses. The maids tried their best to please them. But the girl's father wasn't sure they were allowed such luxuries. The girl's slightly younger sister told her apprehensively that something was wrong. Jerry realized it too. They really weren't going to let her go. The girl's little sister squealed with delight that everyone was very kind and she liked it. The boy asked his sister to live in the capital. Jericho asked in surprise where they would get the money for that. The cousin handed Jerry a parchment and informed her that Araf's inheritance had passed to her, and that his father had sorted out all the paperwork, so she had nothing to worry about. Jericho remembered how her uncle had told her, by the way, that after the funeral ceremony he would help settle the remaining business. Jerry stared shocked at the parchment, reading it. Now she realized angrily what the older man had meant. Her cousin informed Jericho that she got more than just land and money. After all, her father was a hero and the only dragon slayer. So she, as the only daughter of Araf, inherited his mission. The girl's heart skipped a beat at this news. The girl asked in surprise and shuddered, realizing the full extent of the problem. Many people might have liked this change in life, but not Jericho. Little Jerry was frightened of the nobility. She was told that the nobles cut off the heads of commoners like chickens. They told her that the most important thing was not to tie her life to rich people. Because of such grim tales as a child, Jericho developed a fear of nobility. Her older brother asked her not to think of it as something difficult. For once she gained influence and wealth, she would be able to provide her stepfather with a luxurious life. The man added that in addition, her younger siblings would live like aristocrats. He asked her to accept this good fortune, at least for the sake of her family. Jericho was angrily beating her feather pillow in her private chambers. The girl repeated that she would not. She shouted angrily that she was no mistress. Jerry repeated that she didn't want to be because she wasn't an aristocrat. The girl with tears in her eyes flopped down on the bed. She asked her mum what she should do. Jerry didn't understand why they wouldn't just leave her alone. If she hadn't turned out to be his own daughter, she wouldn't be here anymore. Hiding under the blanket, the girl whimpered. She cried that they could easily mistake her for an imposter and strip her of her head, that this mission was too burdensome. After all, Jerry was very afraid of the nobility. The girl suddenly heard the man's disgruntled muttering in her head that she couldn't listen to it any longer. Jericho crawled out from under the covers and jumped up on the bed. She shouted loudly the question of who was there. The girl turned her head back and forth fearfully. She somehow thought a ghost was talking to her. but she heard words that really threw her into a stupor. The voice said he was a dragon slayer. Jerry stared at the sword that stood nearby. Perplexed, the girl slid off the bed and went to the sword that stood near the wall opposite. The girl came close to the sword and pinched her cheek palpably to make sure that what was happening was real. Afterwards, Jericho twisted her head in all directions confusedly, for she thought that someone in the room could have been bullying her like that. Sword grudgingly asked her if she really didn't understand why people acted this way, because if not, she had an obligation to find out. Jericho drew her sword from its sheath with delight in her eyes and raised it upwards. It glistened. The girl stretched out that the sword really did have consciousness after all, for the voice sounded as if it were inside her head. The sword replied that of course he could speak, for he was the only sword that possessed consciousness, the Dragon Slayer sword. The girl asked, perplexed, that the only sword with consciousness, the Dragon Slayer sword, was not too long a name. The sword replied smugly that it was clear at once. Jerry asked why he had decided to talk to her now. He replied that he couldn't stand her whining any longer. Sword grudgingly told the girl that she needed to find out why these people were acting like this. The girl tensely noticed that she could not only hear his voice, but also feel his emotions, and he was very annoyed now. Jericho asked the sword if he could share his thoughts on the matter. The sword grumbled irritably that that was not why he had spoken to her. He said she should start by understanding what dragons were. The girl assumed they were powerful demons. The sword shouted for her not to dare, so to speak, anywhere if she didn't want to embarrass herself. Jericho didn't look at him contentedly and considered not even hitting him. Sword clarified if Jericho knew that their continent was divided in two by the Huff Mountain Range. It is on this ridge that the almost immortal dragons live. In the past, you had to pay tribute to the dragons to get from there. However, there have been cases of some unsavory individuals kidnapping creatures of other races. After such incidents, the dragons closed the passage from humans. Some people even tried to pay bribes, but the dragons were not interested. About 30 years ago, one of the dragons that lived on the ridge became insane. His behavior spread to the ordinary demons of this world, and they began to kill as well. Sword went on to say that this had become a continent-wide problem. The dragons had organized a meeting, but what was a blink of an eye for dragons could take years for humans. Jericho seemed to doze off from the sword's long story. The sword shouted unhappily for her to wake up, for the main part of the story had begun. Dragons were the strongest on Earth. Only a great swordmaster who could release the energy of a blade was able to pierce their scales. Swordmasters are only born once every 1,000 years. Sword solemnly reported that then Mr. Araf appeared just in time. The Emperor gave the man orders to slay the mad dragon. Taking his sword, Araf risked his life and entered the battle. When the man stabbed the dragon's heart with his sword, blood flowed. It was in that instant that the consciousness of the sword was born. Then the sword became the sword that could slay a dragon, if there was one who could take it. The girl held out that Sword was cool. She had already sat on the bed with him. Sword called her an idiot and ordered her not to interrupt. He said she was wondering why people were acting so weird, he said. The sword informed her that she was the only one who could wield it. The girl honestly admitted that she didn't need it. The sword muttered grudgingly that he didn't want a sucker like her either. He repeated to her that it could only be wielded by those with its master's blood in their veins. The weapon also informed her that it meant her children would be able to use it in the future. Jerry stared at him with incomprehension. After a few seconds, it reached her and she shrieked unhappily. The people around her needed her blood. Jerry became hysterical and started waving her sword and screaming that this mission was only because of him. She ordered him to give her back her past life immediately. Sword replied that he didn't know it would happen like this. The girl fell to her knees and began to cry. She did not know what to do, for she was only 17 and was not yet going to marry. The sword assured her that the life of an aristocrat was not so bad, for she would be accepted as the daughter of a hero. But the girl grudgingly added that they would also try to stealthily draw her to their side, and despite her determination, she would eventually succumb to the sweet speeches of the nobles and give in. The girl imagined herself with many crying children. She thought she would end up living a life she would regret. Jericho mentally shattered that fantasy and yelled that she didn't want to. She yelled that she never wanted this. Jerry wanted to live her life like she used to. The girl burst into tears and mumbled that she was going to become a merchant and marry someone she liked. Sword suggested that she could insist on it, And maybe she would be matched with an appropriate groom after all. Jerry yelled that it was all because of him and she didn't want that. The next day, the girl woke up with swelling due to tears. Mistress asked the girl aghast what was wrong with her. Jericho scratched her head and said she just missed her mum. The woman replied that she understood that the girl was not feeling well, but that they had to get rid of the swelling by tonight. Jericho stared at her incomprehensibly. The girl asked why tonight. The woman handed her an envelope with the imperial seal. The woman informed her that today His Majesty the Emperor had expressed a desire to dine with the hero's daughter. Jericho stared at the letter in horror. The whole household stared at Jericho with rapt attention. Here and there they could hear the rapturous exclamations that she was a beauty. Her cousin's wife remarked that even though she had no clothes, the dress fit properly. The woman was glad that no one would even suspect that the garment came from the Huff Mountain range. Her daughter Emily was going to wear the dress in winter, but who would have thought it would suit Jerry so well? The woman apologized to Jerry, for they had not had time to prepare. She promised to give her a different dress next time. Jericho thought she should apologize, for she had taken the dress from a young aristocrat. The girl's younger siblings were twirling excitedly around her. They said she looked amazing. Jerry thought it would be less embarrassing to be called mistress when she was dressed like that. The woman informed the girl that she would now list her guests who would be at dinner with her. She said that His Majesty the Emperor and Empress Jericho had already seen. Also, Princess Lily would be there. The princess is the Emperor's sister. The next guests are the first and second princes. They can be distinguished by the color of their eyes. The first prince has the Empress's blue eyes. The second one has green eyes like the Emperor's. The woman told the girl that she would recognize the third prince at once. Jericho asked her why she was so sure. The woman bent down to her ear and covered her mouth with a fan. She whispered to the girl that the third prince was Princess Lily's illegitimate son and His Majesty's adopted son. The third prince is albino, so he has snow-white hair. The girl thought with delight that this was the handsome boy from the funeral. She realized that it was also the mother and son. Sword whispered snidely to Jerry that she had forgotten what the Emperor and Empress looked like, but she remembered Magno and Lily. He warned her to be careful of the handsome men. Jericho grudgingly told him to stop reading her mind. The woman struck up a conversation regarding Princess Lily's marriage. Jerry remembered and told her that she wasn't married. The woman confirmed that, and remarked that that was why the topic of the princess and the third prince should never be brought up. Afterwards, she began to list other can'ts. Jericho tensely noticed that there was no end to the forbidden topics. She decided it was best to keep quiet. It would be lucky if she could answer at least one question from the imperial family. Suddenly, a great idea struck the girl's head in her humble opinion. Jericho shifted her gaze to the sword. She addressed him, respectfully calling him Lord Dragonslayer. Sword asked not to be intimidated by that, for why had she started calling him that? The girl began to sweetly tell the sword that he was much smarter than she was, so she would feel safer if he went with her. The sword replied that if he didn't have to kill anyone there, he'd be fine. Jericho pouted her lips and said that she would be easier with him. She asked why he was so cold-blooded. Sword replied that he would rather stay at home than in her inept hands. Sword ordered the girl not to shake or forget that she was the daughter of the master. Jericho answered him hysterically that it only made her more tense. The frightened maid ran into the room and announced that the Emperor's carriage and a man from the Emperor had already arrived. She stammered and told her mistress that she had to hurry. At the carriage, the girl and all the household that had come out to see her off stared shocked at the very person from the Emperor. This person was the third prince. The young man melancholically looked around at all the people who came out to him. Everyone bowed quickly to the prince. The girl's brother gave the traditional greeting speech on such occasions. Jericho did not understand why such a high-ranking person had arrived. His brother covered Jerry's shaking face. She was insanely grateful to him, tears welling up in her eyes. The man told the prince that if he had warned in advance of his visit, they would have prepared a proper reception. He apologized. The third prince indifferently informed that his arrival was an order from the Emperor. Jerry's cousin said with a smile that it was an honor, for His Majesty had sent the prince himself to fetch his sister. The prince remarked again that it was the Emperor's wish. Jerry stiffened tensely. The girl turned around and saw everyone on their knees. She didn't want her father to be in a situation like this. Jericho felt guilty that they were all on their knees because of her. Tears flowed down her cheeks. The third prince asked where the dragon slayer was. She replied that she was in a room of the Miweo mansion. The prince announced that the emperor wished to see him. He apologized that they would have to go after him. Jerry's older brother reported that they understood their intentions, but the sword was dangerous. The third prince insisted. He again calmly informed them that it was His Majesty's order. Jericho happily swung open the doors to the room. She shouted loudly to the dragon slayer that she had good news. Sword turned to her and asked what was wrong. He tensely asked why the girl had returned. The girl took the sword in her hands and informed him that the third prince had come for her, and he said that he was the one the emperor wanted. The sword replied to the girl that it was not in his power to disobey the imperial order. Jericho was madly happy that she had a partner in this ordeal. Sword asked if the road to the palace had been an ordeal for her. Jerry told him that she felt he was glad of it too. After all, after Mr. Aroff had stopped moving the last time Sword had traveled anywhere. The girl came down the stairs and smiled softly at the Sword, saying how nice it was that he was invited too. The prince bowed to the girl and said that he was pleased to meet her. He said that he, Magno Nufe, would escort her to the palace on the emperor's orders. The girl was surprised that he called her Duchess. The Sword was surprised that Magno pretended it was their first meeting. The girl bowed and told the man that she was Jericho Miweo. In her mind, Jerry tearfully asked her father for forgiveness. The prince said that they could leave then. Jericho, walking behind the third prince, quickly turned her head and informed everyone that she had gone. The girl's father only raised his head after her words and looked at her anxiously. The girl felt very ashamed and sorry for her father. Tears sprang from her eyes at the sight of the man. Jericho froze in front of the open carriage doors. Sword asked snidely if she could get up in such a long dress. He suggested that Jericho swing it a couple of times and he would cut her dress off. Jerry answered him that there was no need for that. Jerry smiled embarrassedly and informed the Sword that she would put it down first, then pick up her skirt, climb up, and take it back. Suddenly, the prince took the girl by the waist and put her inside the carriage. Jericho cried out in surprise. Sword asked what had happened. The girl's feet in heeled boots stomped loudly as she landed awkwardly. Jericho stood startled in the same spot where the prince had placed her. The young man climbed up behind her and apologized for his actions. The man sat down on a couch inside the carriage and threw a quick glance at the girl, who still hadn't moved. The prince told her that although the ceiling was high, you could hit it while driving. He asked her to sit down. Jericho awkwardly flopped down on the sofa across from him. Sword stretched out with understanding that the prince was, therefore, the girl's escort. She hooted tensely in response. The girl informed the weapon that she had thought before that the emperor would send an ordinary servant girl. The Sword replied that he had thought so too, but apparently the emperor was promoting the prince to her as a groom. Jericho asked the Sword indignantly why he thought so. The Sword explained that two young men of different sexes had been put in the same carriage unattended for a reason. The girl fake punched the Sword with her fist and ordered him to stop scaring her. Jericho looked anxiously at the young man in front of her. She exhaled with a measure of relief. The girl was uncomfortable, but she was grateful the third prince was just being quiet. The man sat relaxed on the sofa and even covered his eyes. Stopping outside the imperial palace, the third prince reached out his arms again and took Jerry by the waist to lower her down from the carriage. Jericho thanked the man and gripped her sword tighter. The third prince melancholically informed the girl that His Majesty had personally ordered her to be treated with courtesy. The Sword mockingly noted that Jericho's heart beat faster at the prince's proximity. Jerry ordered him to be silent. The girl, accompanied by the third prince, walked along the corridors of the imperial palace. Everything around was covered with gold, which glittered with the efforts of the servants. Jericho noted to herself, shocked that the palace was huge. It seemed to her that behind one of the large doors was a banquet hall. She tensely remembered Mistress Sylvia telling her something about how to excuse herself if she suddenly vomited. Jericho had developed symptoms of anorexia after her father's death, and when she ate, her stomach churned back up. The Sword was telling her not to worry. He reassured the girl that in the whole empire, she was the only one capable of holding it. Though she didn't realize it, her worth was on the level of the people in the imperial palace. Jerry whimpered at his words. The girl stroked the Sword fondly and told him that if it weren't for him, she'd probably be dead in the carriage. Jerry thanked the Sword, but it was embarrassingly silent. The girl did not notice how the prince led her to the right room. The third prince's servants opened the door with a creak, and he told Jerry that they were there. Jericho shuddered when she saw everyone at the table. She remarked pessimistically that this was where she would die. Her heart was pounding loudly in her chest, and it seemed that in the silence that reigned in the dining room, everyone could hear it. Jerry thought she was going to die as soon as she entered the room. The girl immediately bowed as she was told to by Mistress Sylvia. Jerry murmured that she was honored to meet His Majesty. Leveling up, the girl announced cheerfully, gathering her strength into a fist, that her name was Jericho Miweo. The Emperor smiled broadly in return and greeted her, saying that the journey was not close. Jerry remembered Mistress Sylvia's admonition that instead of making mistakes through ignorance of etiquette, it was better to try to behave naturally. The girl mentally thanked her mistress for these instructions and thought that the Emperor had a pretty good reaction to her behavior. The Emperor invited the girl to take a seat at the table with them and make herself at home. Jericho looked at the princess and thought that she and the third prince remembered her and the third prince well from the funeral. The girl shifted her gaze to one of the Emperor's native sons and realized that she didn't really remember the others. Jericho thought that she must have really had a hard time that day if she had a hazy memory of such high-ranking personalities. The Emperor smiled contentedly and reported that when he saw the third prince and duchess together, he was surprised at how well they looked. The third prince calmly replied that he was honored to hear such a thing. The girl smiled embarrassedly, but inside she was already feeling the rush of hysteria. Sword noticed that the third prince was cold even to the Emperor. Jericho twisted in her seat, not knowing where to put her sword. If a maid touched it, there would be trouble, and the girl realized it. The Empress noticed the girl's hesitation. The Empress told the girl with a smile that meant it was the Dragon Slayer. The woman waved her hand to the side and said the girl could put it there. The girl turned in surprise at the direction the woman was pointing her. Jerry saw a golden dragon-shaped stand that was made especially for the sword. The girl appreciated the coolness of such a thing. She told the sword that it would look like a warrior's sword. The girl put the sword down upset, for she had to part ways with her partner. The sword made a joke to Jericho. He said that if anyone saw her face, he would definitely think they were breaking up for good. After the Duchess sat back down at the table, the Empress announced that since everyone was in place, dinner could begin. The first and second prince turned to Jerry with a smile. One said he heard that Jerry had been unconscious after the morning ceremony. He asked how she was feeling now. Jericho replied that she was much better. The young man asked if she liked living in the castle. Then he asked again if she was surprised to learn that she was a bastard child. Another prince told his brother that he thought he had asked too personal a question. The other said that the first one was also curious. The Emperor asked them to calm down and not to discuss it in front of the Duchess. Jericho tensely drank water from her glass. She thought the imperial family would be scary and strict, but she didn't seem to see anything horrible. Only the princess and the third prince stood out. Jericho suddenly noticed that the princess kept a displeased look on her face. The girl noticed again the peculiar beauty of the princess. She had the same transparent eyes as Prince Magno's, though the color was different. Jericho tensed her whole body, for why the princess was drilling her with such a glare. The woman defiantly turned away from Jerry. Jericho thought that the princess might be in a bad way or have done something wrong. The Emperor asked if the Duchess had raised a dragon slayer and how many times. Jericho honestly admitted that she had once last night. The man remarked that she had done well, for even just lifting a sword that possessed a mind was not easy. The Emperor said with a smile that it would be nice if the Duchess could raise her sword one more time in the palace. Jerry thought he seemed to think it was because of the dragon slayer that he had called her. The girl obediently agreed to the Emperor's request. She got up from the table and walked over to the sword. Jericho pulled on the hilt of her sword and raised it upwards. The Emperor remarked with visible delight that the view was beautiful. The man said that 20 years ago, this sword had crushed a mad dragon by order of the past emperor. The sword was made by the best craftsmen from the finest materials. The girl used to think it was just a sword from legends, and it had just been passed from hand to hand. The sword grudgingly asked her if she had said everything. The Emperor said that if it wasn't for Duke Miweo, they wouldn't be sitting in these seats right now. He said that he was pleased to see the Duke's daughter that raised the Dragon Slayer and became an extension of the Duke. Suddenly the Emperor told the girl that he wanted her to be with him more and more. He asked her what she would say to that. He asked her if she would marry one of his sons. The man noted that he had 3 sons, each with his own strengths, and it might not look like it, but they grew up to be good boys. The sword held out that the Emperor wasn't even hinting, but saying it directly. He asked how Jerry was doing. Jericho laughed hysterically in thought. She abruptly reached for the sword to pick it up. The sword screamed at her to stand and do nothing. The girl could not stand it any longer, for she was so worried that she was going to vomit. The sword asked her to calm down, for they expected her to be asked to marry. The Empress noticed with concern that the girl did not look well. She suggested that Jericho stay with them tonight. Such a suggestion frightened the girl even more. Jericho clutched her heart in horror. The Empress noticed the Duchess shivering and said that she was freezing. The woman asked to raise the temperature in her chambers. Jericho began to stammer. She asked to go to her home after all. The Empress and the Emperor smiled sweetly at her and assured her that they would have the carriage ready tomorrow morning, but let her stay tonight. Jerry kept hiccuping and repeating that she wanted to go home. She mentally screamed to just be sent back. The third prince approached the Duchess and asked her to follow him. Tears came from the girl's eyes. The young man calmly and indifferently informed Jerry that he would escort her to her chambers. The girl walked hunched behind the prince and hiccuped. The hiccups still wouldn't go away. The swordsman noticed that people said that if you gave a person a good scare, the hiccups would go away. Jericho answered him defiantly that she would soon die of fear there. Quite unexpectedly, the third prince told the girl that she was very strong. This surprised the girl and distracted her from the hiccups. The Duchess lowered her eyes and stuttered again. She said she looked like her father. Afterwards, the girl lifted her thumb up with her thumb and happily said that the prince was also very strong. Only after her words did she flinch sharply and stiffen. The maid behind her exactly repeated the girl's actions. Jericho remembered Mistress Sylvia's words about what on no account should have been said. The girl was not supposed to bring up the topic of Prince Magno's origins. That was why she and the maid flinched at the casual phrase. Jericho noticed that it was as if the young man had become sad and was waiting for her to finish her thought. The girl tensely said that was all she wanted to say. The third prince broached thoughtfully that he must be like his father too. After his words, the man turned away from the girl and walked on. The maids, as well as the Duchess, froze and did not breathe, waiting for the prince's reaction. In the private chambers, the girl was relieved to be on her bed. Sword noticed that she was frightened if she even stopped hiccuping. Jerry replied frustratedly that she'd better get on with it. Sword noticed that it seemed the imperial family was overdoing the pushing after all. The girl whimpered to Sword and said that she was very uncomfortable, that she couldn't find a place to be. Sword asked if she realized it was because of him. Suddenly, the attention of the girl and the sword was drawn to a strange clanking sound from one small room of her chambers. The clanking sound was repeated over and over again. Jericho asked the sword what it was, probably a mouse. The sword sarcastically asked where a mouse would come from in the imperial chambers. The girl naively replied that such sounds could be made by a large mouse. The sword assured her that they couldn't be here, because the imperial palace had magic against rodents. The sword said that maybe it was some scum who sent the mercenary because he can't let a bastard own a dragon slayer. The girl frightenedly began to hiccup again after Sword's words. Jerry gripped her sword tighter and walked slowly towards the door from which the clanking was coming. The girl said that whatever this mercenary was, he would not touch her. She solemnly declared that she had the sword. The sword's reply startled the girl. He said that since he was just a sword, if the opponent also used the weapon, he would not burn. The girl was surprised that he was reading her mind. The sword replied that she was its spare master. Jericho grudgingly interjected for a spare master. The sword held out that she was more likely a follower of his master. From behind the door came sounds again. Jerry said it didn't matter who she was to the Mechu right now. She went to the door. Sword suggested that on the count of 3 they open the door. He started counting down from 1. Slowly the sword said 2. Before the number 3, the girl gulped loudly. With a hint of action, the sword uttered 3, but the girl did not move. Jericho yelled aloud 4 and swung the door open. Sword asked in bewilderment why she did it on 4. Jerry looked at the sword and honestly admitted that she was scared, so she decided to count some more. She noticed that it was too dark and she couldn't see who was there. The sword took pity on her and glowed with fire. Jericho looked at it with delight. She stretched out with childish admiration that it was glowing. The sword said aka magic sword. Thanks to the light from the sword, the girl was able to see who was in the room. It was the man who slept in the small bed. It was the strange guy who was at the funeral ceremony, the son of the head of the magic tower. The young man sniffled softly. Jericho asked the swordsman why the man was sleeping here, to which he indignantly asked her how he knew. The girl was horrified to think if he could be another suitor for her husband that the emperor had appointed. She quickly recoiled back from the bed. Sword didn't think the emperor would go for such a thing. Jericho speculated as to what the guy was doing in the women's quarters then. Sword replied that if he was from the imperial family, he would hardly be sleeping in the wardrobe. The young man began to wake up slowly. The sword noticed this and said that now he could be questioned about everything. The girl said hello to the boy and introduced herself as Jerica Hands. She whimpered to herself because it had been a long time since she had been introduced by that name. Jericho asked why he was sleeping in the imperial chambers and if he had been hired to kill her. The young man blinked sleepily in response. After his lips stretched in a happy smile, the guy said happily that the beautiful dream girl was in front of him again. The young man muttered that it had been a good dream and covered himself higher with the blanket, going back to sleep. Jericho stared at the sword, which was still emitting light in bewilderment. She didn't understand what was wrong with this young man. The girl indignantly asked the guy what he was doing here. The girl asked the guy indignantly what he was doing here. The boy wiped his eyes and was surprised to notice that it wasn't a dream after all. The guy began to look at the girl from head to toe. Jericho stood in front of him in her nightdress. The boy jumped up startled and shouted that Jericho was a harasser. The girl wondered who else was a harasser. The boy grudgingly asked if her mother had sent her. He grumbled and said that she was a witch because he didn't think his mother would find him there. Jericho remarked indignantly that she was staying here at Her Majesty's request. The young man asked in horror that the Empress was at one with his mother as well. He wrapped his arms around himself in a protective gesture. The guy seriously began to declare that no matter how beautiful a red-haired girl Jericho was, she still couldn't seduce him. Jericho thought the guy was crazy. The girl irritably tried to explain to the guy that he was confused because she was planning to marry the person she would love. The boy shouted hysterically that he would also marry the one he liked. Jericho assured him that she was happy for him and asked him to come out of there now. The girl pointed to the sword and asked him if he could see it, because if she touched it, it would turn to ash. The boy recognized the sword. The young man confusedly asked if the guest's girlfriend was right. Jericho was relieved that he finally got it. The boy scratched his head and apologized. He said that there were usually no people in that room, so he would sneak in there unnoticed and sleep. Jericho shouted indignantly that she couldn't let him go that easily. The girl earnestly repeated her full name to the guy again and asked who he was. The boy stared at Jerry in bewilderment, and his hand froze awkwardly on the back of his head, which he scratched. He answered that he was Senshi. Senshi lowered his hood unhappily and muttered that the witch from the magic tower was his birth mother. He didn't know his father, but he hoped it wasn't a monster. He liked it in these chambers, since his mother had no power to find him. Sword gave the girl the last name Quatre. She immediately asked what it meant. Sword replied that the head of the magic tower was a half-breed from a human and a fairy. The olive color of the boy's hair was passed down to him from his mother. The girl remarked in surprise that this was why this guy looked like a fairy. As it turned out, he really was a she. The guy was stretching after a nap. Then the boy began to make something in the air and blue patterns began to flash. Jericho was surprised to notice that she had seen it somewhere. The guy's actions brought back memories for the girl. So many things had happened in her life that everything seemed so far away now. The girl shockingly realized that the guy had created a magical teleport. The guy smiled at her. Jerry noticed that he looked like a normal person when he smiled. Senshi immediately told her not to even think about falling for him. Senshi pointed his finger at her and said that his soul and virginity would belong only to his beloved. The magic from the portal illuminated the room with a blue light. The girl immediately showed the guy her tongue and shouted that she wasn't going to fall in love with him. Senshi disappeared into the depths of the portal. Jericho tiredly plumped down on her bed, placing the sword next to her. Sword admitted to the girl that he remembered something when he looked at Senshi. The girl turned her head and looked at the sword. Jericho tiredly interrogated what exactly he remembered. Jerry took the sword in her hands. He gravely remarked to her that she wanted freedom, and he wanted a cooler master than her. Jericho asked resentfully that he didn't like her. The sword replied that it wasn't that he didn't like her, but he was a sword and needed a strong master. The girl began to swing her sword. She was frustrated that she could swing it. The sword asked if she could cut flesh with it. Jericho snorted in horror at the sword's question and admitted that she didn't want to. The sword's words made her visibly tense. Sword continued that since she wants freedom and he needs a master who needs blood, she has the opportunity to be free and make a good living. The girl brought the sword closer to her face and asked what she had to do. The sword answered at once that it was only to find the master's son. Jericho recoiled indignantly from the sword and asked, shocked that she wasn't his master's only child. Sword shared that his master once told him that there were 3 guys who could turn out to be his sons. The girl spat on the bed unhappily at the fact that there were 3 of them. The sword said that his master was very popular with women. Jerry grudgingly remarked that she was not interested in that, and it was time to get to the point. The sword said that the master used protection as much as he could, but in some situations it was impossible. Therefore, among these women, there was one who had given birth to a child after such a liaison. There were only 3 women who matched their due date. The girl irritatedly concluded that they meant they had 3 candidates. She asked why no one knew about it. Sword explained that her father wanted to preserve the honor of his partners. After all, someone had already been married. Besides, if he found out it was his son, the woman had to be bound to him, but he felt that none deserved to live with a corpse. The girl seriously noticed that her father was an overnight adventurer who respected women. He was the best option for a one-night stand. Sword said that her father would have cried if he had heard such a thing about himself. The girl apologized awkwardly, noting that she'd been a little overzealous in her assessment of her father. The girl noticed that looking at Senshi, the sword remembered that he might be his father's son. Jerry said indignantly that she should have touched him lightly with the sword. The sword asked if she was crazy, because she could have killed the boy. Jerry assured him that she was joking. The girl blossomed when she realized that she could go back to her past life. Sword asked her to stop smiling like that because she looked like a fool. The girl sat down on the couch in front of the bed and asked Sword what the names of the other possible candidates were. Sword remembered that the first candidate was Princess Lily's son, and at the moment, the Emperor's adopted son, Magno. The next candidate on the sword list was the eldest son of the owner of Star's trading company, Rosen. And of course, the last possible son of the master is the son of the head of the magic tower, Senshi. The girl flexed her fingers tensely after each name of a possible claimant to her father's inheritance. She was clearly not happy about the variety. Jericho said doomedly that it would never work, because you can't just meet with these people, and even to start such personal topics. She fell to her knees and said that this was the end, and she would have to be a duchess for the rest of her life. Sword began to reassure the girl and asked that she not despair, as the master claimed that one of them was definitely his son. Tears were streaming down the girl's cheeks, and she asked the sword doomedly if her father had told her who exactly. The sword replied that her father had said it was a secret. Sword added that there was one frightening thing in all this. The girl looked at him angrily and unhappily and asked him what he was talking about. Sword replied that it was the Emperor's order, for he had ordered the 3rd prince to escort Jericho, and that he aimed to make Magno her husband. Jericho was silent for a moment, comprehending this. The girl screamed hysterically. She caught the sword's train of thought. The sword said it would be love between a half-brother and sister. Jericho hugged herself and screamed that she didn't want that to happen, in case they did turn out to be stepchildren. The girl shook that she was also pleasantly worried as she looked at the 3rd prince. Sword prodded the girl and said that she was worried too at the sight of Senshi. Jericho flashed her eyes at him and replied that the strange guy was smiling very nicely. She said that now no pleasant thrill at the sight of them. But the sword didn't calm down and asked the girl not to forget about Rosen's stars. Jerry said that he was right and that he should be kept in mind, even though the girl didn't get a good look at Rosen. Jerry asked the sword that if one of the boys was really her father's son, wouldn't that be a good thing, and why their mothers wouldn't announce it themselves. The sword replied that all 3 of them belonged to noble houses, and no one knew how society would react. Besides, the sword believed that every woman had her reasons. Jerry herself knew how dangerous it was to prove parentage sometimes. Jericho agreed and asked the sword if there was anything he could do to control the ignition of an unrelated son. Since the sword began to possess a mind, thanks to the dragon's blood, his oath is similar to his oath. The sword swore that only the heir could become its master, and that it could distinguish it from another's only by touch. That was why the sword was out of control. Jericho replied that it was clear to her that nothing was clear. The sword confessed that it actually thought she would also burn when she touched it. After all, the master had not told the sword that he had a daughter. Jericho shrugged and smugly replied that life was unpredictable, and she was surprised that her father remembered her mother. Jericho reached for her sword with her hand and said she heard him in general. She wanted freedom, and he a worthy master. If Jerry finds Mr. Araf's son and gives the sword to him, she will be free and the sword will be with its new owner. The girl rejoiced at such an ingenious idea. The girl offered the sword, forgetting to strike her hands, but remembered at the last moment that he had no hands. Jericho happily waved the dragon slayer around and shouted that they would make it work. Sword laughed. Sword informed the girl that she had seen two already, and how she was looking at seeing the last one. Jerry reasoned that she couldn't move freely and how she would see him. Sword didn't worry about such thoughts. He had a plan, which he immediately outlined to the interested and surprised girl. The morning greeted the girl with bright sunlight that flooded the entire courtyard of the imperial palace. The birds were chirping loudly. Jericho stood with the maids and looked at the carriage that was being prepared for her. The third prince was still gone. The girl stood pensively, for she realized that she had almost married the possible son of her own father. The girl stood pensively, for she realized that she had almost married the possible son of her own father. Jericho thought there was a more appropriate name for such cases, but they were complete strangers after all. She couldn't bear to call Magno that. The girl asked the maid that she would like to stop by the Stars Trading Company before traveling home. The maid bowed and said she understood. Jericho was jubilant, for everything was going as they had planned with the Dragon Slayer. The first step of the plan had come to fruition. There were many houses that want to get their hands on the sole heiress of the Miweo family, so the younger Duke of Arrivo locked up Jerry, so no one would lay eyes on her. Sword speculated that the Emperor might want to marry her off to a prince. Sword believed that even if no one from the imperial family was suitable for Jerry, the most important thing for her was not to choose someone with the same influence as Duke Arrivo, then no one would keep her locked up. That was why the sword thought that using the imperial carriage was their chance. Jericho stomped determinedly towards the carriage prepared for her. The Stars shopping center impressed the girl because the room moved by magic. She stood at the transparent wall and watched what was happening outside. Jerry and her escort were very high up in the lift. She was excited to see what the capital city looked like from above. In the capital, the Stars shopping center is considered the tallest structure after the government office. All the other buildings seemed small to Jerry. The girl darted from side to side to see everything. Sword asked her to calm down, because he thought she was overexcited. A young girl accompanied Jericho. She reported that they had almost made it to the top floor. Jerry was shocked that they had gone up so quickly. Jerry had been told that the top floor was the restaurant and reception area for expensive guests like herself. The girl whirled her head around excitedly, looking at everything. Sword asked her not to forget herself. The sword reminded Jerry that she had come there to meet the owner's possible son, not for a stroll through the mall. The girl rubbed her head awkwardly and replied that she remembered everything and he shouldn't worry. The girl was taken to a room and sat down on a sofa. The company representative asked Jerry what brought her to their shopping center. Jericho was confused at first. Jerry mentally murmured to the sword that they had been given free tea and biscuits here. She was embarrassed not to buy anything. Sword replied that she had plenty of money and could buy whatever she wanted. The girl fearfully informed the sword that she had no money. The sword assured her that all the master's money was now hers. The sword suggested her new mistress to shop properly for gifts for her father and the younger ones. The girl smiled happily that she could shop for her family. Jerry quickly turned to the woman and informed her that she wanted to buy treats, toys, and children's clothes, as well as a man's suit, shoes, and hat. The sword afterwards informed her that it wasn't enough. She needed to buy something else. Jericho broke off and without thinking threw to the woman that she also wanted gems, rubies. She soon realized the situation and realized that the rubies were unnecessary. The girl shuddered at the fact that she had overdone it and asked if she was sure she had enough money. The sword replied that she had so much money that she could buy the whole center. The girl looked at the sword in disbelief and said that if it was not true, she would take it to a pawn shop. The sword laughed at her threat and said she was a fool, for it could not be touched. The girl was pulled away from her skirmish with the sword by a voice that called her by title and forced her back to reality. The woman reported that just as she requested, they had put everything together according to the wish list. The girl wondered how they knew the sizes of each of her family members. After all, even the ages were correct. Sword explained that it was an indication of how aware the merchants were of her. The woman brought rubies for Jericho. They had prepared only the highest quality stones for her. The girl only now realized that she was surrounded by expensive things. The woman enthusiastically told Jericho that of all the stones she had chosen rubies, and that it showed her exquisite taste. Jerry wondered, for she knew nothing but rubies. Jericho regarded the rubies for the first time. She thought Magno's eyes were more beautiful than the stones anyway. The woman assured her that a low-grade ruby would not go with her beautiful hair color, as it would only spoil the look. So the woman wanted to recommend one chain to Jericho, but she didn't have time. She was interrupted by loud protests and inhibitions from someone at the door that led to the corridor. The servants forbade anyone to enter the room, arguing that there was a high-ranking guest. There was noise and clamor. Jericho asked the woman interestedly what was going on at the entrance. The woman bowed and said that they would check it out. The servants were forbidding some gentleman to enter. Jericho was curious, and she whirled her head round to get a good look at the intruder. But the guest still managed to break through the servants, and he strode resolutely into the room. The young man exhaled heavily from such a fight with the servants for the right to enter. Jericho sighed in surprise. After all, this was the possible Rosen heir for whom she had actually come to the shopping center. The woman shouted indignantly at the young man for what he was doing in the reception room for special guests. But that didn't stop him at all. He went to Jericho. The young man took Duchess Miveo's hand in his own and apologized for such insolence on his part. Rosen heartily told the bewildered girl that he had heard of her arrival and could not help but come to see her. Jerry thought she had come to see him too. The boy kissed the girl's hand, causing her heart to pound, which didn't go unnoticed by the sword. Jericho thought she hadn't been able to see the guy at the funeral. Rosen smiled sweetly at Jericho and said that they had seen each other at the funeral ceremony after the guy introduced himself. Jerry thought Rosen was handsome and recognized that he was her ideal. The girl was embarrassed and blushed. She introduced herself to the boy by the surname Miweo, mentally apologizing to her stepfather. The woman next to him informed the guy that she would report him to the head of stars. Jericho paid no attention to her, glowering at Rosen's proximity. The boy replied that his mother had nothing to do with it, and that he would take full responsibility. The woman was indignant that he had not only rudely barged in, but that he had the language to say such things. Rosen bowed and replied that his desire to see Jerry again had made him forget his manners. As an apology, the guy informed her that she could take the goods for free. Jericho was stunned by his words. The girl reassured Rosen that everything was fine and there was no problem. Sword asked Jerry to come to her senses, for the boy could be her possible brother. Jerry replied to the sword contentedly that even if she did, it didn't change the fact that his handsome face made her blush. The girl surmised that Rosen had a wonderful personality. The guy smiled sweetly at her. Sword sternly stated to the girl that she never had an older brother, so she didn't understand something. As handsome as Rosen was, he was her possible brother, so Sword asked if the pretty faces of the younger ones also made her blush. That comparison brought the girl to her senses in a flash. Jerry asked Rosen if he had any business with her. Jericho reasoned that this guy is probably Mr. Araf's son and has a rich mother. Plus Rosen had red hair, very similar in shade to hers, and the guy also carried a sword. The girl decided that she must have found her father's son. The sword called out to her and told her that it wasn't certain yet. Jericho indignantly told him that Rosen had red hair and a sword after all. The sword replied that Jerry should be quieter and not give herself away. The woman surmised that the Duchess was tired, so Rosen should speak sooner. The boy assured her that he only wanted to see her, and if she was tired, he would go. He apologized again. The young man turned around and glanced at Jericho as he was already leaving the room. As the girl was getting into the carriage, two men were arguing over who would pay for her. One was the head of the Star Center, and the other an envoy from the Imperial Palace. Each had been ordered to pay for Jerry's purchases. Jericho rejoiced. It didn't matter to her which one of them would pay. What mattered was that everything would end up being free. The woman who accompanied her looked anxiously and asked to say something to the Duchess. The Duchess moved towards her with interest. The woman whispered a warning in her ear that the eldest son of the Star's home had a very busy personal life. Jericho was shocked. She told Sword that she seemed to have been misunderstood, asking him if she was that disturbed. Sword asked her to recall her behavior. Jerry flopped down on her bed in the Duchy of Arrivo. To her, even this place felt like home after the palace. The Sword reminded her that she had only recently wanted to go home, but now she was glad for Arrivo's home. Jerry admitted that she had become less afraid of them. She never imagined that she would be greeted by all her relatives on her return. Thanks to that, she gave everyone presents at once. Sword replied that everyone wanted to see her in good spirits. Sword was right that the head of the family didn't particularly like Jerry going to the mall alone. She remembered how she'd flinched at the sight of her cousin. Jericho doomedly acknowledged the Sword's rightness, that if they hadn't discreetly traveled today, they'd never get there. Jerry fidgeted in bed. She asked Sword what he thought about whether Rosen looked like Mr. Araf's son. Sword replied glumly that the probability that he was his son was the highest. The girl jumped up happily. She said cheerfully that the Sword thought the same as she did. She remembered that Mr. Araf did not have green eyes like Rosen's, which upset her. She sank down on the bed in doom. Sword snidely remarked that the girl was not particularly different from her father, for they both had an immediate crush on the family members of stars Rosen and Platinum. The girl speculated on the similarities between the young man and her father. It seemed to the girl that when she said goodbye to the guy, he looked at her like that, as if he really wanted to say something. Jerry wondered if he might want to admit that he was the son of Mr. Araf. The Sword swept up that he didn't know how things were in her village, but there are plenty of people with red hair in the capital. Plus, most of the nobles walk around with swords. The girl countered that the guy did look like her father, handsome, with red hair and age-appropriate. She asked the Sword why no one suspected him. The Sword's next words dumbfounded the girl. He told her that Platina Stars had been married 8 times and divorced 7 times. The woman had been a party animal. Also, Platinum has a fetish for red hair, so all 8 wore that color. Sword revealed that she wasn't even officially dating her master. The man was a free knight. When money was needed, he moonlighted. He hid his identity and made a contract with the woman. Eventually, Platinum cleverly managed to seduce the girl's father. The Sword added that her master had promised to give her hot nights for the rest of the contract. Jericho was fascinated to hear the Sword and stomped on the biscuits. She asked why the Sword had stopped. The one Riley remarked that she didn't like such stories, did she? Sword concluded that that look Rosen had on Jerry might mean that he wanted to hook up with her. Jericho hiccuped at that inference. Jerry angrily grabbed the Sword and started cursing at it. The Sword awkwardly apologized. The Sword suggested that the lad might really be the master's son, and wants to get hold of him by getting close to her. Jerry asked if it would be better for the Sword then, since Rosen knows how to swing a sword. Sword admitted that of course it was better, as Rosen was the one he liked the most out of the presumed 3. Rosen is an amazing swordsman. Sword said that his master was a great swordsman, and when the topic came up about a successor, he was happiest when talking about Rosen. Sword was a little sad at the memory. Jerry wondered what had happened between them and Mrs. Platinum, for the Sword had cut short his story so abruptly. The girl was very much interested. The Sword replied that she was contradictory and he didn't think it was worth telling her. Jericho asked, willing him to relax and tell her everything after all. But the Sword remained silent. The girl started hitting him with pillows, resenting that it wasn't fair, for he was intrigued at first and then silent. Feathers flew in the air from the pillows. Sword took pity and decided to tell the story. Jerry prepared to listen to the story. The Sword told her that the master had a mission. After 5 minutes of telling, Jericho fell asleep. The Sword resented her, for she herself had persuaded him to tell. Suddenly, in the semi-darkness of the room, a man's shadow fell on the bed of the girl who was sleeping peacefully. The young man exhaled quietly and scrutinized the girl, who fidgeted at his rustle. This guy was a Sword. He thought the girl was sleepy. The guy carefully covered Jericho with a blanket. The guy concluded that the girl and her father are similar only in appearance, and their characters are completely different. But he thought that the owner really liked the girl a lot. The boy looked at the girl carefully, sitting down beside her. His master had never once told him he had a daughter. Apparently, the man himself didn't know until she raised her sword. The boy wondered why he was so anxious to keep her safe on the day he died. Apparently, the man knew he didn't have long to live and wanted to fall into eternal sleep, thinking that his own daughter had come to him. She would have come a little earlier, when he could still feel at least a touch. The boy gently touched the girl's hair and thought that the owner would definitely be happy. The girl cringed at the young man's touch. He smiled sweetly at this sleepy reaction of the girl. The boy decided it was time to get back to normal form. He wished Jericho sweet dreams. 2 days later, Jericho stood at the window, shocked and horrified to see what was happening behind him. There were a lot of boys in the yard. One lonely, handsome boy, the girl thought, could be her nephew. The second guy, who was even younger, was old enough to be her grandchildren, and the third was also younger than the girl. There has been a mobilization of boys in the Duchy of Arrivo who are fit for marriage. Sword noticed that the Duke was acting quickly. The reason for such a flurry of activity was the girl's account of what she had been doing in the imperial palace. The girl's cousin informed her that she should have told him she wanted to visit the shopping center. Jerry thought that then he would have called all the people from it to the estate just. Jerry replied that she had just remembered that she had never been to the capital and was interested in going there. Her brother apologized to the girl for being inattentive. The man asked the girl how she felt about going out with the young people this weekend. Jerry answered carefree that she would be glad, as she was a little sad because she had not seen anything much. The cousin smiled contentedly after saying that, and said that this is how things are. Jericho only now realized what was behind that smile. She blamed herself for saying it. Sword assured her that at least everything was without coercion. Apparently his brother wanted to create the atmosphere of naturally growing love that Jerry liked so much. But the girl didn't like it all. The sword was telling her to pick the ones she liked best, and they would be willing to kiss her shoes even if she wanted to. Jericho remarked sadly that that was what scared her, because they would agree. Sword asked the girl to stop steaming and start having fun, enjoying being an aristocrat now. After all, her youngest and her father had already managed to settle in here, which was good enough. Jericho cried and asked why she was so unlucky, since everyone had mastered it except her. Sword told her that she wasn't. He asked if it was right to realize that she should strive after her own happiness. After all, everyone in this world lives to be happy, and it's time for her to start. Jerry doubted that he was 17 years old. The girl marveled at the wisdom of the sword. He laughed and said he would give her one piece of advice. He said how to meet all 3 candidates and delay the moment of marriage. Jerry asked indignantly why he hadn't told her that before. Sword called her laughingly silly and told her to listen carefully. He suggested she go to the academy. The girl was surprised. Sword told her that although all the candidates study at different courses, they go to the same academy. The first candidate, the red-haired, handsome Rosen, was in his 5th year at the academy. The second candidate, third prince of the empire, Magno, was also a second-year student at the same academy. The third candidate is the son of the head of Senshi's magic tower, too, except that he's in his 4th year. Sword said that the academy usually has 4 years of study, but it could be longer. The sword said that the academy was normally a 4-year program, but that it could be longer. Jericho excitedly asked the sword how on earth she could get into the academy. Sword informed the girl that she would need to pass the entrance exam at the end of this month to get in this year. The girl immediately sank down. Jerry was hysterical and said that she hated studying. Sword replied that as much as she hated it, she would still have to. Sword remembered that aristocrats could get in by donating money, but you have to have a high school level. Jericho started screaming that she was finished. After all, high school is a place where only smart kids learn. Sword asked her, shocked that she was completely unable to learn. The girl answered in the affirmative. Her mother was always pregnant, the younger ones needed care, and her father was always at work, so she had no time to do it. Sword said that she would definitely have to make a donation then. Besides, she had a special case since she was the daughter of the master. The girl happily thanked the hero's father. Jericho happily entered the new plan into her little notebook. Now she was going to enter the academy and find Mr. Araf's son. The girl happily showed the sword how beautiful her handwriting was. The sword swore, for it had forgotten that she couldn't even read the letters in the written language of the nobility. The sword did not make the girl happy with his next words. He said that the academy used not only the regular letters, but also the letters of nobility, and if she didn't want to look stupid, she would have to learn them. Jericho was studying the letters of nobility when her cousin walked by. The man thought she was beginning to slowly join the world of aristocracy. Jerry thought they weren't that complicated. A few days later, the girl was sitting in the senior duke's chambers. The man asked her if she liked everything, since it had been 2 months since her arrival. Jericho assured him that everything was fine and asked how he was. When she had first seen him, she had thought she would die of fear, but now she was hardly afraid anymore. He replied that it was like all old men. Her uncle asked if she had begun to learn the letters of nobility. She admitted that it was difficult at first, but that she was learning quickly. The man noticed that Iraf was smart too, and apparently she got that from him. Sword snidely remarked that Jerry had a blank head in general and only looked like her master outwardly. Jerry didn't like what he said. The girl told her uncle that she was going to enter the Luna Academy. The girl's heart was pounding frantically because she might be forbidden. Her uncle replied with a smile that if she wanted to learn something, he could hire a home professor, or maybe it was worth sending her to Saul's academy. After all, it was only for nobles. Jericho thought that rich people even spoke the same way, for her cousin had said exactly the same words to her. Suddenly, her uncle stroked her hair and informed her that he had heard that Slay was bothering her lately. The man said he should personally stop his son. Her uncle asked the girl if she didn't like Slay's behavior. Jericho nodded quickly. Her uncle admitted that he too had felt greedy at first and wanted her to be with someone from their house, but if she didn't like it, he wouldn't force it. He promised to inform her about her enrollment in Luna Academy. Jericho thanked her uncle eagerly. She thought he was very influential. Sword surmised that she could become one too. Her uncle told her that their father was the same age as he was when Iraf went to the same academy. The man admitted that he had been puzzled by his father's permission at the time, but now he was beginning to understand him a little. Jericho was surprised that Mr. Iraf had also studied at the Luna Academy. The sword answered in the affirmative, but something happened that prevented its master from being released. Afterwards, he had a big fight with his father and became a free knight. The girl wondered why he had quarreled. Jericho wondered if her uncle saw a young Iraf in her and therefore allowed her to enter the academy. Jerry was uncomfortable, for her uncle was older than her dead grandfather, but she thought he was a very warm and friendly man. The girl excitedly thought that she would now go in search of her father's son at Luna Academy. Jericho rejoiced greatly, for the first step had been successfully taken. Elderly Uncle Jericho stood by himself in his chambers and looked out the large panoramic windows. The door to the room creaked open. A man entered the room, saying that his uncle had authorized Jericho to enter the Luna Academy. That man was his son, Jericho's cousin. He was unhappy with his father's decision. The man asked why he had done it, because a little more effort and everything would have worked out. His father turned around and answered him that he didn't think Jericho was his brother's own daughter at first. The man was even willing to introduce her to Iraf. He was going to give her money and send her back afterwards. The father noticed that it was his son, assuming she was another imposter who made her take the sword. The son eagerly replied that he just didn't like the fact that all those people were cheating his uncle. Slay asked why his uncle had to die like that, because as the savior of mankind he could have suffered such a fate. He didn't understand why he had to forgive the unscrupulous people who tried to cheat his sick uncle. Slay cried bitterly and blurted out that if it weren't for Iraf, they might have been dead long ago. If it hadn't been for his uncle, the mad dragon would have torn them all to pieces long ago. The father said nothing to his son's questions. He waited calmly for Slay to wipe away his tears and calm down. Then his father told him that if Jericho had not raised the sword then, he would have received the money long ago and left their house, but Jericho had raised the sword. By doing so, the girl proved that she was a true daughter. So, the man wanted to give the girl everything she could possibly want. Slay did not contradict his father. He obediently replied that he understood his father and that Jericho was still young for marriage. The man turned round and added that he would therefore wait for the girl's graduation from the academy. The older man thought that giving Jericho that ID card as evidence was too much, for it was too expensive. Most likely, the girl was born right before the battle with the mad dragon. Iraf probably didn't think she'd survive, so he gave that ID. The man realized that his brother's motives would remain a mystery to him forever. Both Iraf and the girl's mother were already in the ground. The man wondered if he would be able to ask in person when he was beyond the edge. Jericho sat by the window in the early morning. Out of habit, the girl got up early in the morning, but because of the servants, she had nothing to do again. In the village, a girl did everything with her own hands. When she wanted scrambled eggs, she gathered eggs. When she had to meet Jerry the doctor, she cooked a donkey. Suddenly, behind Jericho's musing, her cousin and Mrs. Sylvia entered the room. They gave the girl a great fright. Jerry quickly greeted the people who came in. They laughed, for they did not think they would frighten her. Mrs. Sylvia laughingly remarked that she shouldn't have distracted Jerry so abruptly. The man told the girl that he had already prepared everything for her admission to the academy, so she didn't have to worry. Jerry tensed, thinking that even though he was being nice, she was still afraid of him. Jericho was worried about whether she should learn the rules of etiquette and propriety beforehand. The man answered her that it was taught at the academy, and she would learn it there. Jerry did not expect such indifference to the rules from her brother. The cousin gazed intently at the pensive girl, as if trying to understand something. The man told Jerry that only Sol Academy does not have this subject, because it is only to know. But not only aristocrats enter the Luna Academy, so they have such lessons. Sword noticed that he had clearly read Jerry's mind. Her brother's next words made the girl drag her feet out of that room. He said that Jerry would have a strong faculty to teach her the basics, so she should study hard and take her time. Jericho shook and told Sword that she was afraid to even hear about training. The Sword asked her if she was going to go to school. The girl smiled slyly and answered in the affirmative, but with the correction that she was not planning to study. Jerry smiled happily and said that they were going there to find the new master of the sword, the son of Mr. Araf, but the girl was not going to study. The girl complained that she wasn't feeling well and was going to see her youngest. Sword said that the others would envy her life. All the children were in the same room when Jerry found them. The younger ones were scrutinizing the cards and were engrossed. Jericho crept up quietly so they wouldn't notice. The girl managed to scare the younger children of the family. They jumped up in fright at her shriek. The children were delighted to see her. The children of her new family were also there, calling her Grandma and Duchess. Jerry couldn't get used to the fact that she was already a grandmother. Her younger brother laughed at being called Granny at 17. The girl called him an arsehole. May's little sister asked Jericho to take her in his arms. The girl was just a baby. Jericho asked her to wait, for she was then paying her brother back for making fun of her. The girl slid the sword into a large wardrobe, leaving it there with a thud. This was done for safety reasons. Jericho asked him to stay in the wardrobe for a while. Sword mumbled that she should be back soon, or he'd threatened to take offense. The girl happily returned to the little ones and began to play with them. She asked if they missed her, to which she received affirmative answers. Eki asked Jerry to throw him in the air too, but the girl was shocked to hear that he had grown so big so fast that she couldn't play with him like that. Eki immediately snickered and took offense at his older sister. The children of her new family looked at her with delight. Jericho asked if they wanted her to lift them too. The children immediately agreed and thanked their grandmother. Jerry mentally whimpered, for she thought she would never get used to being treated like this. The girl twirled and tossed her grandchildren around. She rejoiced with them. Jerry thought they were cute aristocrats who didn't scare her at all. Immediately after such thoughts, the girl suddenly shuddered and froze. Jerry informed the sword that, unlike adults, little aristocrats were not scary at all. Jericho told the children that she would like to rest a little because she was tired. The girl asked where Carrie and Daddy were. Her brother told her that he'd seen Sis Carrie with Emily, and her father had been going to the workshop lately. Jericho mumbled that they must be used to the capital by now. Jericho asked why she didn't know all this. Eki said that she was kind of busy because she was applying to the academy. Jerry thought she wasn't that busy. The girl remarked to herself that she was so upset that her family was getting used to the capital that she had stopped seeing them all together. The children shared that Mrs. Sylvia had asked them something. The woman asked if the children wanted to live in the Mivio residence after Jerry entered the academy. She said there would be servants there, just like here, and they could continue to enjoy life. Eki thought deeply and added that Mistress Sylvia had called that place Jericho's house. Jericho was confused as to what her brother was thinking, maybe worried about having to change his lifestyle for the second time. The girl cried and noticed that the boy had become so grown up already. But her little brother's next eyes made her finish praising him. The boy shouted enthusiastically that all the noble's money was now theirs. Jericho immediately gave his younger brother a slap on the wrist and grudgingly muttered that who would doubt it. The girl thought that even though she was a little scared, Arrivo's people still cared about her family, and now even if she acted up, she would be at ease. Suddenly a maid brought a letter on a golden tray. Jerry noticed that it even smelled. Sword asked grudgingly if nothing else caught the girl's eye. Jericho looked at the letter with childish delight and asked what the sword was talking about. The sword drew her attention to the sign on the wax that sealed the envelope. The sword recognized the Empress's coat of arms in the sign. Sword's words made the girl's heart pound very loudly. She stared at the letter in shock. The girl awkwardly dropped the letter from her shaking hands and began to catch it in midair to keep it from falling to the ground. Jerry asked fearfully what was going on and why the Empress was sending her letters. They had only just seen each other. Sword replied that he didn't know either and ordered her to open it. The girl was startled to read that the Empress had invited her to a tea party. She remembered that Miss Emily had once said that the Empress sometimes gathered prominent noble ladies for this purpose. Jerry was afraid that it would be soon, and worried that nobles like her were cutting off the heads of commoners like chickens. The sword replied that there was no such thing now. Otherwise, the nobles would lose their heads too. The maid read the letter in surprise. Jerry told the sword that he was lying to her, for the elders in her village had told her everything. The sword said she was stuffy and could live a happy life if she wasn't a coward. The maid left the girl in a hurry and carried a letter to someone. Jerry thought she was frightened too. A while later, Jerry was listening to Mistress Sylvia about how this tea party would be her debut. Mrs. Sylvia explained that it was not an official event, and the girl's uncle could not attend due to illness, so Jericho would be the face of the Duchy of Miveo. To tell the truth, no one had expected it. Jericho was quite frightened by this arrangement, plus she was completely unprepared. Sword mockingly congratulated the girl, and added that soon everything she does will become a family tradition in the Duchy of Miveo. Jerry slapped him and told him to stop scaring him. The women, meanwhile, were discussing what the girl should wear. A sword was not the best accessory for a dress, but it was the Empress's order to take it. Besides, the sword would ensure Jericho's safety. Jerry was glad she could take the Dragon Slayer, for he was always offended when she left him. The women hesitated, for there was no suitable dress for the sword, and little time for sewing a new one. Meanwhile, the sword was asked by its owner if it was heavy for her. Jerry replied that it was light. Sword muttered thoughtfully that it meant length was the issue and sacrifices would have to be made. Jericho tensely asked what he was up to again. What happened next surprised the girl greatly. Something unusual began to happen to the sword after his words. A dark purple mist began to appear around the Dragon Slayer, which hissed strangely. Jerry asked what the disgusting tricks were. All the women in the room opened their mouths in shock and cried out in surprise. The long sword shrank to the size of a large handblade. The remnants of the fog fluttered in the air. Jericho shockedly asked how he did it, and why he suddenly shrank. After all, he wasn't a jumper to sit down after washing. The sword told her not to be surprised as it could adjust its size. It was one of its abilities. Jericho looked at the sword in a daze, for it could shrink and enlarge at will. Jericho honestly admitted that she liked that long sword and would miss it. The girl warmly recalled the time she had spent with the old sword. She remembered swinging it and jokingly punching it with her fist. Mistress Sylvia asked the girl what had just happened. Jericho told the sword that it looked like she would have to tell them everything and asked for advice on how to do it. Jericho admitted that the Dragonborn was talking to her. The women were very much surprised. Jericho's brother's wife admitted that she had heard of Sir Araf actually talking to his sword. The woman also admitted that she had heard that Araf's descendants would be able to communicate with the sword. Jerry decided to tell them everything, except in her own way. She told them that she wasn't really talking to the sword, just seeing its thoughts. Jerry shrieked that he was giving her information now and let her know his will. Jericho threw her hands up in the air and solemnly declared that the sword wished to become smaller. The sword tisked and asked what kind of circus this was. Jerry took the don't give up, lie to the end tactic. The girl asked the sword what the black smoke was, because she didn't know how to explain such horrors to women. The sword grumbled that it was magic. It was washed in the blood of the Dragon of Light, and naturally magic looks dark. Jerry began to make fun of the Dragon Slayer. The girl took the sword in her hands and explained to everyone that its weight remained the same despite the reduction. The women were delighted, as they wouldn't have to alter their clothes. The woman said that Emily had already given her winter dress to Jericho, and they were just about to go to Star's shopping center to buy Emily a new dress, so she suggested they go together. Jericho thought it was a great idea, but there was one but. She looked frustratedly at Emily. The girl had caught up with her sister's adult dresses and was upset about it. Jerry approached the girl in embarrassment and apologized, as she wanted to go to the mall alone and Jericho had ruined her whole trip. Emily said it was no big deal, as she still needed the evening toilet for the reception. Emily announced that if they went to the Stars shopping center, she would find both dresses and new sheaths for Aunt Jerica. At the Stars shopping center, the women were excited to see Jericho in her new reception dress. Emily was shocked by the girl's beauty. Jerica was dressed in a blue outfit with pink bows, which harmonized perfectly with her hair. Her long red hair was gathered into a high ponytail. Mrs. Sylvia said that they had purchased the dress, and now it was time to choose a scabbard. Jericho replied that all the scabbards were very beautiful, and all suited the dragon slayer. The women began to look at the entire large assortment. Some matched a beautiful evening gown, others a scabbard to a riding dress. They wanted to buy both at once, for they would be useful later on. Jericho noted the sword. It had the useful ability to turn into a dagger and asked why he hadn't done it before. Had he forgotten? The sword replied that wasn't the point. Sword explained that he needed life force for sorcery. He couldn't get it from Jericho and he had his own for magic, so it was best not to waste it. He never knew at what point magic might come in handy. The sword told him that it was not good for him to conjure often, for he had realized himself by drinking dragon's blood. With the dragon's magic, the sword was given his madness. The sword has its own power, but when it runs out, it conjures at the dragon's expense. The sword admitted that this had the potential to activate the dragon's madness in it. Jericho wondered how such a thing could happen to a sword. The sword replied that he is the only one like that. So if it has a mind, why can't it go crazy? The sword said that if it had a strong owner, it would have more vitality for sorcery. Jerry, on the other hand, is only a candidate to own it, and her supply of power is meager for it. He said she should work on that. Jericho asked with childlike interest if he could fly after all, as swords in fairy tales fly. The sword replied that of its own free will. No, for it to do something like that, the master must give it a specific order. Without the master's order, he is just an immobile sword. Sword wondered if the girl remembered where he lay, for if he could move himself, he moved to the bed to lie next to Araf, instead of dusting alone. The sword seemed to exhale heavily and fell silent. There was a tense silence between them. The girl looked sadly at her new friend. Sword asked if he had said something wrong that she was looking at him like that. Jerry suggested changing the subject and asked which sheath he liked better. Sword replied that he liked the tight ones. The girl explained that he didn't understand her. She wanted to know which ones he preferred. The sword replied that he only cared about functionality. It could be a simple, functional leather scabbard. Jerry asked the salesman if they had any leather ones with adjustable lengths. The man replied that they had just such a folding model. This model is customizable for both a two-handed sword and a dagger. The man smiled tensely at the girl. Jericho thanked him, but she felt as if the salesman hadn't said enough. The man seemed to remember something and apologized. He explained that he had forgotten, for she was the daughter of the famous hero, Sir Araf. The seller told me that it was a classic model of sheath, which was designed by order of His Majesty, especially for Sir Araf. It was in this sheath that the hero carried his legendary dragon-slaying sword. The man surprised the buyers by saying that the same craftsman produces the scabbard as before. The seller handed the girl the scabbard he had told her about earlier. Jericho looked at the scabbard with interest. Jericho happily informed the man that she would be purchasing this particular scabbard. As the girl put the sword into its new scabbard, she felt a sense of comfort and sadness. Jerry shockingly realized that she could feel the emotions of the dragon slayer. She wondered if he loved his master so much. The sword replied that he had realized his existence with Araf, and if he were a bird, his master would be an egg for him from which he must sprout into the light. For a chick, an egg is a whole world. It has no desire to leave the egg. But it happened that the egg broke before the chick was strong enough to leave the egg. He asked if he had explained it clearly. Jerry answered in the negative, but assured him that he had succeeded in conveying the feeling. The sword explained briefly that his master was both kin and friend to him. Mr. Araf was everything to the sword. Jericho smiled and replied that her father was dear to many, and she was proud to be the daughter of such a good man. Sword said skeptically that she was flattering him, for she didn't even call him father. The women finished shopping and Jericho looked around. She wondered if she would be able to see Rosen. Sword thought they wouldn't see him because of what had happened the last time. He told the girl to tell Mistress Sylvia to retire to the washroom and let her look for Rosen. Jericho said the sword was very smart of her. Sword remarked that he who doesn't take risks doesn't drink champagne. Jericho opened the big doors and shouted that she had urgent business with Rosen. Jericho didn't realize where the young man was. Sword reassured her that she would probably spot him immediately, for he had red hair. Suddenly, at the end of the corridor, she noticed a guy with red hair and thought she had found Rosen. The girl ran after him, but when she caught up with him, she froze in surprise. It was a small child who greeted her fearfully. The little boy looked at her with huge amber eyes. Sword repeated to her that there were a lot of redheads on the island. It wasn't like her province. Jerry said that the baby is still cute and looks like her little brother. The girl asked the boy why he was alone and where his mummy was. Suddenly, the boy poked at Platina, who came out from around the corner and stared in surprise at Jerica, who sat beside her son. Platinum reintroduced herself to Jerica with the trademark Stars greeting with a duty smile. Platinum was the owner of the Stars Trade Guild, an incredible woman to have been divorced 7 times and married 8 times. Each marriage was preceded by a colorful love story. Jerica remembered that Platina adored red-haired men, and all her children were appropriately red-haired. The boy asked to be held in his mum's arms. The woman told Tio not to make his mum angry and not to run away alone again. Platina said her son likes to romp and run away. She thanked the girl. The woman said that Jericho was very kind. She asked the girl to go to her office to apologize for her eldest son and his antics. In her office, the woman apologized for having to take Theo. The little boy didn't want to leave his mum. Jerry assured her that it was all right because she liked him. Suddenly, Platina Strauss laughed. Jericho asked the woman why she was laughing. Platinum apologized that Theo might get in the way. She said that she thought that Theo liked Jericho, since she was still a child herself. Jericho admitted that she just has a lot of little brothers. The woman concluded that they have much in common then, for her family is also rich in children. She has 4 sons and 3 daughters. Jericho opened her mouth in shock, for she could not believe that such a woman had 7 children. The woman admitted that it was beautiful, and gold was their family's strength. The girl thought Platinum had brown hair, but it was like it was glistening platinum now. She thought the woman was the queen of gold. In the village, the girl dreamed of becoming a tradeswoman. The girl thought that Lady Platinum was so cool and she would like to be like her. Sword snidely remarked that it was certainly a good role model. The woman with a serious face told the girl that her son had indeed behaved inappropriately that day. The woman bowed with apologies to the girl, for her son had interrupted the girl as she was enjoying her shopping. Jericho assured her that everything was fine, only she had something to ask. The girl asked what Rosen's title was, for she did not know what to call him, perhaps Lord or Sir or Rosen Stars. Platina was surprised at the Duchess's question. The woman laughed and said that the girl was very nice. Jerica asked why she was laughing, puzzled. Platinum Stars inquired of the girl did her prince say his name was Rosen. Jericho squirmed uncomfortably and wondered if the young man had more than one name. The woman admitted with a smile that her eldest son's name is Rose Stars. Platinum Stars explained that as soon as her eldest son was born, his hair was so fiery red like a rose. Theo shrieked with joy that he had a baby brother, Rose. Jericho asked herself with horror how a grown boy could be named Rose. Sword awkwardly told Jerry that they'd rather have a guy they'd call Rosen. Jericho tensely agreed with her friend. The woman told the girl that she and Rosen had the same hair color. Jericho looked warmly at her loose hair. Platinum compared their red and brightly colored hair to a rose. Besides, in the woman's opinion, they were just as beautiful and she liked them very much. Jerry shivered with embarrassment. Sword ordered her to pull herself together, for Platina was talking about the flower, not her. The woman added, as if by the way, that their shopping center had some good hair care products. Platinum promised to give them to Jerry. The girl meanwhile slapped the blade for the remark. Platinum Stars asked why Jericho wanted to become a merchant, as the woman is a merchant herself, so very interested. Jericho recalled an incident to her. The girl had seen a merchant bite into a gold ring and she had wanted to do the same. The woman laughed and said that was the point. The girl shared that she wondered if it was true that if you bite into gold, it leaves a mark. It's just that in Arivo's house, all the gold pieces are handmade, so you can't take a bite. Sword instructed her not to talk, but to find out information. Platinum looked into the locker that was full of gold bars and said she would help the girl quiet her curiosity. She explained that excessive patience could have a negative effect on mental health. The woman thought that if the girl had asked the people from the duchy, they would have let her check it out, but she was apparently shy. Jericho looked at the gold bars with delight. Platinum remarked that since they were talking about it, she would let the girl try it. The main thing was not to damage the seal on the ingot. Jerry's heart thumped loudly. The sword asked Jerry to come to her senses, for that ingot was worth far more than anything she was wearing. Jerry didn't believe it. Sword reminded her of the gold bath at the duchy and explained that nobles had a different understanding of cost. Jericho decided that since she was here she would bite properly, and immediately the girl did just that. Sword asked indignantly if she could hear him or not. The girl looked at the bar of gold with bated breath and realized that the marks were indeed left on it from a bite. Platinum laughingly noticed the girl's admiration and explained that gold was softer than ordinary metal. Theo asked his mom to do the same as Jericho, too. The woman allowed her son to take a bite of the bullion as well. Platinum told the girl that she was now much like her father. Platinum Stars replied that she didn't know if Jericho was aware of it, but her father had once moonlighted as a soldier, hiding his real identity. Jerry cheerfully informed her that she knew that. The woman said that there were times when they had to work together and she paid him in gold. Then Iraf, like Jericho, liked to bite into the gold, explaining that he was jealous of the heroes in the books. Platina shook her head and admitted that she had thought she was a soldier, but when she found out who she really was, she added that when she remembered, her blood ran cold. The woman thought her son had behaved this way with Jericho because of a joke she had once made to him. Jericho listened carefully. Platina laughed and told the girl that she had once joked to her son that Mr. Araf was his own father. Jericho's whole body shuddered when the woman told her this. The woman asked if she imagined that her son really believed her. Jerry staggered, for Platinum Stars claimed it was a joke. She asked Sword if that meant that Mr. Araf was not Rosen's father. Sword replied that perhaps she had said that on purpose. Sword has heard that her relationship with her son has deteriorated over the issue of inheriting the trading company. If Rosen turns out to be the master's blood son, he will likely become a warrior, and Platinum doesn't want that. Jericho thought that Platinum Stars wasn't lying to her. Sword asked to listen to him because this woman is the head of a major trading company, so she can be very skillful at deception. The woman admitted that there was indeed something between them, but she asked not to be misunderstood. It was just that they were both independent of anything, that is, they were free to act. Jericho, shocked, told Sword that how did all the nobility talk so easily and openly about their sex lives? The Sword explained that loose relationships had become common since the invention of kinship magic. Sword believed that even without it, Platinum had enough gold to feed all her children and reach that pinnacle where they wouldn't dare point a finger at her. Jericho agreed with him enthusiastically, for the woman was also divorced at the time she saw Mr. Araf. Platinum Stars glanced at her watch and oohed, for she seemed to have delayed the girl a little. The woman apologized again for her son, for he just has a lot of respect for Araf's son and wanted the joke to be true. The Sword reprimanded that she was definitely doing it deliberately, for something was wrong here. Suddenly, an uninvited guest entered Platinum's office. The man immediately apologized. The woman greeted her son with a smile and said they were just talking about him. The boy was embarrassed and told his mom that he had asked her so many times not to call him that. Rosen coughed and greeted Jericho, and the girl answered him cheerfully. The boy's manner of speech was very different from the one he used towards his mother. Jerry even liked Rosen's voice. She noted with admiration the fine muscles hidden beneath the guy's clothes. Sword nodded wryly and reminded her that the guy could be her brother. The girl sadly assured him that she knew. She couldn't help it because the guy was her type. A servant came in and announced that all of Jericho's companions had gone to another boutique. Jerry thought they must have realized that her conversation was going to take too long. The servant asked if he should escort the girl. Jericho was too quick to assure him that he didn't need to. She didn't want to spoil Emily's mood again. Jerry asked him to tell his companions to take it easy and help Emily pick out pretty things. Platinum looked at her son and said how good it was that they were finished. The woman asked her son to escort the Duchess to the duchy. The girl and the boy cried out in shock at the same time. Jerry began to assure the woman that she shouldn't, but the Sword started shouting at her, telling her that this was her chance to talk to Rosen. Platina ordered her son to escort the girl, as his sword skills were not needed yet anyway. There was tension between mother and son. It was as if Platinum was trying to give them a chance to talk. The woman asked what was the big deal, because he himself wanted to be friends with the Duchess, and this was a great chance for him. Jericho was surprised at the woman's directness. The girl told the Sword that she felt some kind of closeness with the boy, as if they shared a common bloodline. Sword ordered her to calm down. After all, she was just sympathizing with him because of the pressure his mother was putting on him. Rosen exhaled heavily. Jericho noticed that he looked fascinated, as if he was thinking about the future of the country. The young man scrunched up his eyes as if he had come to terms with something and accepted it and looked at Jericho. He held out his hand to the girl. Rosen asked the girl to escort her to the duchy. The girl agreed and remarked that she was counting on him. When the boy noticed that none of the girl's servants would be in the carriage, he decided that it was impossible for the two of them to go alone. He ordered one horse to be brought to him. Jericho tensely began to assure her that everything was all right, and he could go with her in the carriage. Rosen replied that she couldn't do that because it might cause unnecessary rumors. Jerry realized that she couldn't miss this chance to talk to him alone. The girl moved closer to the guy and called out to him, calling him gentleman, saying she wanted to chat with him. The young man was very much surprised at the girl's words and froze shocked. He smiled sweetly afterwards and replied that he was younger than her in title, but she calls him Lord all the same. Jericho remarked fondly that the boy looked like Mistress Platinum. She thought he was cute, plus so shy. Sword asked indignantly if she would come round or not. She had already made him melt at the sight of men. Jerry asked him to get into her position, for there were no handsome men in her village. The young man with a smile asked the girl to just call him Rosen. The girl replied that he could just call her Jericho then. Jericho mentally cried, for if she didn't know he was her likely relative, she would definitely fall in love. The guy admitted that he also wanted to talk to Jericho, which surprised the girl. He suggested that she go to a cafe. Jerry thought that here was their chance. Jericho looked rapturously at the cafe her boyfriend had brought her to. She thought he had a knack for good places. Sword snidely remarked that he was just taking the girls there. Jerry mockingly asked if the Sword was reacting too coldly. He replied that he was doing his best to keep her particularly charmed. The girl was drinking tea with pleasure. She told the boy that the tea was very tasty in this cafe. Rosen replied that he was glad that she liked it, because his acquaintance had recommended it to him and he sometimes came in. Jericho slyly translated his words in her own way. This acquaintance was apparently an ex-girlfriend, and now the guy was taking other girls here on dates. The girl noticed a strong windiness and thought that Rosen was definitely Mr. Araf's son. Rosen apologized for that incident, because he had been out of sorts at the time and really wanted to have a chat with Jericho. The girl assured him that everything was all right. Jericho informed him that she herself felt uncomfortable about having to give him all the goods at his expense. Rosen assured him that everything was fine. The guy assured her that it wasn't that much money. Jericho was stunned because there were so many things, but the guy didn't seem to care. Jerry thought sadly that she should have taken the bar that Platinum had offered her as a souvenir. The Sword had persuaded her not to take it, for the woman wanted the girl to be in debt. The girl put the cup on the table and decided it was time to get to the topic. Jerry asked directly what the boy wanted to talk to her about. Rosen started awkwardly, feeling very uncomfortable in front of the girl and Mr. Araf for his subsequent words. Sword picked up on the fact that the lad had gone straight to the subject and was as straightforward as his mother. The boy averted his eyes in embarrassment and said that he had just thought that Mr. Araf might be his own father. Rosen immediately bowed and apologized for his insolence. Jericho assured him that there was nothing to apologize for. Jericho imagined that as she handed the boy the sword and said that if he really was the son of Lord Araf, she was only glad. The girl strained to think that she really wished she could say that. Rosen assured the girl that he now realized that it was just a joke on her mother's part. Then the boy was warmed by the thought that the esteemed Mr. Araf might be his own father. Rosen was angry and upset when his mother confessed that she was only joking. But the boy's respect for the hero only grew. Rosen thought that even if he was not his father, he would become a great man like him. With this motto, Rosen began to train and help people in difficult situations. Sword said mockingly that the boy had a great ambition, unlike some people. The girl noticed that Rosen spoke as if he knew he was not Mr. Araf's son, but Mrs. Platinum claimed he still believed otherwise. Some small part of the guy's soul still hoped he was his son. But then the man died and Jericho came along. The guy bowed apologetically and admitted that he thought she was a fraud. Jerry stopped him and said he shouldn't, because he had reason to think that. Rosen didn't believe to the last that the girl had raised a dragon slayer, until he saw her with him at the funeral. That's when the guy realized shockingly that all the rumors turned out to be true. Jerry wondered if that was why he was sure he wasn't his son. Rosen hoped so, because to him, Araf is a real hero and teacher. The guy honestly admitted that he had even considered trying his hand at dragon slaying after having a fight with his mum over his career path. Jericho froze for a second at the guy's words, but then held out the sword in its scabbard across the table to him. The girl asked if he wanted to try it now. Rosen was surprised that the Duchess was carrying the original. Jerry explained that the dragon slayer could change shape at will. The girl said she'd never seen such cool swords before, though she'd seen a few in her short life. The young man stared tensely at the sword and swallowed hard at the lump in his throat. He thought it was the most beautiful and powerful sword in the world. The boy hesitantly reached out a shaky hand to the blade that lay on the table. But at the very last moment he clenched his fingers into a fist, not daring to touch the sword. Rosen shook his head and admitted he couldn't. He was still clinging to the words his mother had thrown out when the boy had wanted to visit the Duchy of Arrivo. Platinum was screaming at him to leave, and if he took that sword, he was no longer her son. That's what the kid's mum said. He said she never said that, no matter how much they fought. Jericho took the sword back and asked him if Platina was doing this so Rosen wouldn't find out he was Mr. Araf's son, or so he wouldn't die. The girl decided not to persuade the young man further, because she thought it was dangerous. The boy lamented that it wasn't easy when Mum was a shrewd businesswoman, although he thought his story only made it harder for Jerry. He apologized. Jerry replied that it was a good story. The girl asked why Mrs. Platinum wanted him to be the one to inherit the company, as he still had brothers and sisters. The boy happily replied that it was because of his peculiarities. Jericho asked me concernedly if there was anything special about being a good merchant. The sword suggested that it might be the ability to foresee the future. Rosen pondered something while Jerry mentally communicated with the sword. The guy called a little boy over to him and asked him to buy them 2 lottery tickets and himself something at the same time. Jericho noticed with delight that Rosen was very polite to the children. The sword unexpectedly agreed, for he thought it was unlike hypocrisy. The boy brought 2 tickets. Jerry asked what would happen if they won. Rosen said it was written on the back. The first place prize was a sum of money that could be used to buy 10 cow heads in the future. Jerry was delighted. The sword assured her that there would be more afterwards. Rosen watched the girl with a smile. He thought she was cute in her directness. Jerry jerked herself away, for she was not allowed to blush, for they might turn out to be related. Rosen suggested that she open the tickets and see what was inside. The girl upsetly remarked that she hadn't won anything. Rosen honestly informed her that he had won. The guy had second place. Rosen won 2,000 gold pieces. It may not have been first place, but it was enough to buy an unborn cow. Sword asked how long Jerry would measure everything in cows. The boy said that a long time ago, one of the ancestors of the House of Stars had saved a golden fairy, and she had bestowed a golden blessing on their family. The boy said that a long time ago, an ancestor of the House of Stars had saved a golden fairy, and she had given them a golden blessing. These children are capable of increasing their fortunes no matter what they do. Jerry noted with delight that this legacy was 1,000 times better than swordsmanship. Jericho asked in shock if Mrs. Platinum had this gift too. Rosen reassured her that his mother didn't have it, and that people like him weren't born very often. So Rosen thought that if he turned out to be Araf's son, he would be able to hide it thanks to the blessing. Sword exhaled and said that he understood Platinum now. It's hard to let go of a blessed son. Jericho understood why Mistress Platinum was acting like this. She looked at the boy with delight and asked if she thought Rosen glowed gold. Jerry expressed the thought that Mrs. Platinum might have been lying. Rosen said whatever was true, he still didn't want to inherit the business, even though it would make it easier for Platina if he wasn't Araf's son. The girl concluded that she would be rooting for Rosen and his future either way. The boy smiled sincerely, and it was as if he was glowing gold again. He said that Jerry's support gave him strength. Jerry smiled back tensely and thought it was hard to keep her cool after hearing about the golden blessing. The girl's heart was popping. The sword was getting a little flustered, too. The boy said he'd heard that Jerry was going to Luna Academy. Rosen was also studying there and hoped to meet her there. The girl thought how quickly rumors spread. Rosen asked what speciality she had chosen. The girl replied embarrassed that she was still thinking about it. She asked the sword if she had to choose something. Rosen was surprised, because usually majors are chosen at the same time as the application. Jerry smugly replied that she had a special case. The boy suggested that she choose fencing, because he thought she had a talent, as she was the daughter of Mr. Araf. Jerry thought that she was too indifferent to enroll. It was hard for the girl to look into Rosen's eyes, which were full of respect. Rosen assured her that if it was hard to adapt, she could turn to him. The boy explained that it wasn't because she was the daughter of someone he respected, but because Jericho seemed friendly. Rosen honestly and sincerely admitted that he was comfortable with her. Jericho was immediately embarrassed and blushed thickly. The girl quickly looked away. She didn't understand why she liked the guy's voice, hands, face, even his personality. The girl felt a certain closeness with the guy. She thought it might be because of the blood relation. Jerry replied that she would like to be friends with him too. Jerry asked if someone like her could socialize with him. After all, even though she was unexpectedly, even to herself, the heiress of Mr. Iraf, she was still a commoner. Rosen froze in shock. The guy abruptly and angrily jumped up from his seat and took the girl by the shoulders. Jerry was startled by this reaction. Rosen shouted at her not to talk like that. Rosen shouted that he too had been born out of wedlock, but still everyone saw him as the son of the House of Stars. Jerry looked away tensely, for the boy was too close. Jericho averted his eyes and replied that Rosen was absolutely the son of Mistress Platina. He remarked that she was the daughter of Mr. Iraf, and there was irrefutable proof of that. The guy alluded to the sword. Jerry thought that if only she hadn't picked up the sword, her life wouldn't have changed so much. Rosen emphatically stated that if anyone insulted Jerry with such language, it would mean that they would insult him as well. Guy said that she could address him at any time if anyone dared to tarnish her honor. Jericho's heart thundered at the boy's words. He promised that he would come to her even from the edge of the world. Jerry was delighted by this determination. Rosen sat back down, and Jericho clenched her teeth tensely so as not to give away her violent reaction to the guy's proximity. Rosen apologized for his reaction. He explained that he could not ignore Jericho's concerns. The girl waved her hand in front of her face to get a burst of air, for she should have pulled herself together immediately. She thought that they had only just met, and Rosen was so genuinely worried. Jerry told the sword that she now understood why Rosen had such a busy love life. The girl remarked that he didn't seem to do it on purpose, but she was falling for him anyway. Sword snidely remarked that he had talent. Rosen said with a smile that he sensed his little sister in Jericho, probably because of the color of her hair. Jerry replied that she too felt the closeness between them. For her, the most likely possibility was that he was Mr. Iraf's son. The boy said that she could address him as you like a big brother. Jerry responded by saying that he could use you too. Jerry thought it would be more comfortable to address him by you, but she wanted to continue calling him by his first name. Rosen didn't mind. The girl melted at the young man's smile. Sword ordered her to come to her senses, for Rosen was a possible brother. Sword suggested that she better call him her older brother so she wouldn't fall for him even more. Jericho thought he was indeed right, for she had previously addressed him as Mr. Iraf's son. The boy smiled sweetly at Jericho. The girl thought it was time to address him as Brother Rosen. Rosen delivered Jericho to the estate close to sunset. He noticed that he had delayed her a lot. Jerry assured him that it was all right, for she was just in time for dinner. The young people could not say goodbye to each other for a long time. They argued about who should leave first. Rosen laughed and said Jericho couldn't be persuaded, so he left and said they'd see each other again. Rosen rode off on his horse. Jericho asked what the sword thought of the boy. She thought the sword would look great on the guy's belt. The sword agreed. Jericho was jealous, since Rosen is blessedly handsome and also rich and able to wield a sword. Sword admitted that he wasn't aware that the House of Stars had been blessed by the Golden Fairy. The girl remembered that the head of the magic tower and her son were kind of fairies too. Jerry thought maybe she could ask them for some kind of blessing the next time she saw them. Sword asked her to listen, as fairies didn't really have a real body. Jericho froze in surprise. She didn't understand how that was possible. Sword told me that fairies are part of the great nature. Their power is extremely powerful, but they can hardly influence humans. Jericho didn't know about it. Sword said that based on that, the fairies' blessing could be compared to a true miracle. Jerry asked what about the forest fairies. Sword replied that some gave up their powers in exchange for a real body. They are the ancestors of the forest and earth fairies. The girl replied disinterestedly that it was like stories from fairy tales. Suddenly, the indifference flew off the bored girl's face and she cried out loudly. Jerry said that Rosen had a lot of younger siblings too, and she thought of something. Sword asked what it was because she was going to sleep. The girl shouted indignantly that even if she found Araf-san's son and gave the sword to him, her children would still be candidates. This meant that she would never be able to return to her normal life. The sword fell abruptly silent. Jerry tensely wondered why the sword was silent. Jericho felt waves of praise and sympathy from the sword. The girl asked indignantly what the sword's emotions were. Sword admitted that he kept wondering when she would figure it out. To his surprise, the girl figured it out quickly. Jericho was outraged. The girl shouted a question loudly, asking if that meant she was right, and what she should do now. Sword asked her not to worry, as he had already thought of everything. The sword reminded Jericho that it could only be owned by a descendant of its master, so when they found it, they would say that only the descendants of the new master could own it. Provided Jericho, the sword and the new master keep the truth a secret, then it's unlikely that anyone will try to verify it, because in that case you'd have to risk your life. Jericho held the sword in her hands and thought deeply, digesting the new information. The girl replied that everything was correct. The girl started chirping to the sword that she liked him, such a smartest, coolest sword ever. The sword jokingly said he'd upset her beforehand, since they wouldn't work out because he's a sword. Jericho replied that she was just praising him since he had a really cool idea. Sword assured that she could continue then. The girl started spinning around the room with the sword. Jerry shouted that it was the best, cool, beautiful, strong, sturdy, and all shiny. The sword laughed merrily in response. A few days later, there was a rehearsal for Jericho's future tea party. The girl was awaiting the unexpected news that her younger sister Carrie could also become an aristocrat. This surprised the girl greatly, for Carrie was in no way related to Mr. Araf. The girl's relative replied that Carrie was indeed not related to the past representative of the House of Mueo, but she was directly related to the current one. Jerry, as the head of the house, had the right to add her sister to the family tree. Thus, the girl would become an aristocrat. The woman assured that even if someone was against it, Jerry was the head of the house and was free to make such a choice. Carrie tearfully informed her that she certainly wanted to study, but never hoped to become an aristocrat. Jericho asked her younger sister to calm down and informed her that if she didn't want to, she wouldn't force her. Jerry's relative asked her not to worry, as she was just getting to know the other noble ladies at the upcoming tea party. Jericho asked if she would need to show good manners. Mrs. Sylvia answered in the affirmative, but it would be enough for the girl to start by figuring out where the front seats were and where the back seats were. The woman asked which way was the front seat. Jericho answered, confused and at random, that it was where she was sitting. The mistress reported that this was the correct answer. Sword snidely noted that the praise made Jerry very happy. Carrie and Jericho opened a container of raffinade. The girls were stunned by its strangeness and beauty. Jericho used the tongs to pop one into her tea and shrieked for Carrie to pay attention to it, as it was in the shape of a flower. The girls admired the beauty of the raffinade with childish delight. In their opinion, it even melted in a special, beautiful way. Carrie smiled back at Jericho's happy smile and said she was very interested. Jerry offered to put more in her tea. The girls put so much sugar in the tea that Jericho ended up drinking tea that was too sweet. Mrs. Sylvia asked with a smile if the girls understood that such behavior would not be tolerated at the tea party. Jericho and Carrie were embarrassed. Mrs. Sylvia also asked Jericho to remember that at the moment the noblest origin among women in the whole empire was Jerry's. This surprised the girl greatly. But Jerry reacted quickly, smiled, and said she understood. The sword began to sneer and said that it was useless for Jerry to say anything, as she didn't understand anything. The sword vibrated, which caught Jerry's attention and informed him that he would have to restore the former master's greatness himself. Meanwhile, Emily's mother was thanking Carrie for befriending her. After the rehearsal tea party was over, Jerry told Sword that it was over quickly and she had dressed up for nothing. Jerry wanted to see her father, but he was nowhere to be seen. She wondered if he was uncomfortable because he was gone a lot. Sword replied that it was likely, since only the younger ones were related to her by blood, but John was not. Jerry asked if he could stop calling someone else's father by his first name. Sword replied that John was not her own. Jericho angrily, and without thinking well, replied that he was her only father. The Sword fell silent. Jerry realized the mistake and apologized, saying that she had said that for nothing. Sword sadly replied that he understood and knew that everything related to the master, including him, was weighing on Jericho. But Sword noticed that she still had no hatred for Araf. Sword remarked that everything that was going on right now made Mr. Hans feel uncomfortable and inferior. Jerry agreed, for she did not know how her father really felt. Her dad smiled, but Jerry seemed sad. Sad that his children had the luxurious life he couldn't give them. She thought he might be angry that his position as head of the family had been taken away from him. Tears welled up in her eyes and she sniffled. Jericho was crying. She told the Sword between whimpers that her daddy was not helpless as he was an excellent carpenter. They lived poorly, then Mum was ill. There were a lot of children and earnings were irregular. The Sword softened and began to calm the girl. He said that she did not have to justify herself to him because he already knew everything. Sword saw that John didn't divide his children into his own and other people's, and raised Jericho in love. Sword didn't think he should have named his children, though. Jerry reported that the names were given by their mother. Jericho laughed and took stock of how she was able to get upset for such a silly reason. Sword muttered that she was crying, then laughing. He said it was the noblest unmarried girl in the Empire speaking in front of a talking sword. The Sword suggested that Jerry speak to Mr. Hans in person and find out everything. Jericho looked warmly at Sword and agreed. He said that they should do their best for her father. Jericho shouted loudly that she would hand over the sword and duties to her new master, and afterwards return the confidence to her father. The girl threw her hands up in the air and pronounced that she would definitely succeed. At a family dinner, the girl learned that Mr. Hans was delayed in town. A cousin reported her father said that he was in negotiations for a new job. He asked if Jericho knew anything about it. Jerry was surprised. The man said that her father had taken an internship at some furniture workshop. Jericho frustratedly informed her that this was the first time she had heard that her daddy had started working. The girl was amazed. Everyone present stared at Jerry in surprise, for she had called her stepfather Dad. She didn't like the discomfort of calling her daddy in front of them. The cousin noticed the girl's concern but remained silent. He said that Mr. Hans had asked him for permission, to which he had received approval. It was strange for a girl to hear about her dad asking her cousin for permission. Her heart thudded in Jericho's chest. Sword asked her not to get worked up about it, as Mr. Hans was in the duchy as a guest, so he asked permission. Jerry understood what her father did was only his business, but why hadn't he said anything to her? Sword surmised that her father simply didn't want to disturb her. Mrs. Sylvia and the girl's cousin looked at each other understandingly as they both noticed Jerry's confusion. Jerry lay on the bed in her chambers and whimpered. The food in her stomach didn't want to digest, and now her stomach ached. Suddenly, the girl heard a servant knocking on her door and asking if she was in her chambers. The girl opened the door and heard that Duke Arrivo wished to see her in his chambers. The servant explained that it was hard for his uncle to move around right now, which was why he had asked that the girl come to his chambers. Tea was poured for the girl in the Duke's chambers. Her uncle told her that he had already heard about what was happening at their dinner. The man bluntly asked if Jericho was upset about her father. The girl flinched when she heard the question and didn't know what to say. Jericho looked judgmentally at her cousin, who was calmly drinking tea. She realized that he had already told her everything. She was embarrassed. Though she was indeed a little upset. Her uncle told her that he and Araf had different mothers. But because their father had officially remarried, the man had two mothers. Uncle said he had the same as Jericho. The girl thought that wasn't quite true. She knew that Duke Arrivo's mother had died early. The subsequent marriage was formalized with due process of law. Plus, it was important to answer that both Duke Arrivo and his second wife were both members of the aristocracy. The man's point is that your parent's spouse doesn't necessarily become family to the child. But his uncle thought that despite this, he always called the woman, who was even younger than him, his mother. He asked if Jericho understood what that meant. Jerry admitted that she didn't quite. The man asked if her mother was in a common-law marriage with Mr. Hans. Jerry shuddered and quickly blurted out that they were officially married. Uncle asked Jericho why she could not then boldly call Mr. Hans her father. Jericho looked at her interlocutor confused. She didn't understand how she could do that. Her uncle said he knew what Jericho thought of them and Araf, but he thought that if she wasn't sure of herself, others would begin to doubt her. Uncle asked if she thought they had brought her family here to seek her favor. Jerry thought they probably did it so she wouldn't run away, because it would be easy to lock her up if the family was there. Though the girl realized that the family there were treated with respect, it made her a little upset. The brother pulled out the papers and said they thought Jerry had misunderstood everything, so they decided to explain themselves. Those papers were the main inheritance document of the estate. He asked her to read it. Jericho scrutinized the document carefully. It was especially important to familiarize herself with what was indicated at the very bottom. It stated that she was the blood daughter of Araf Miveo, so she would receive the entire inheritance based on imperial law. But to obtain the title of Duchess, she would change her name. The girl muttered about changing her name from Jericho Hans to Jericho Miweo. The man poked his finger at an important clause that stated that she was the daughter of John Hans and Yona Hans. Though she was the blood daughter of Araf, she did not cease to be the daughter of her parents. It was for this reason that Jericho shouldn't have been shy about calling John Daddy. The girl stared at the document in amazement. Her uncle had told her to be sure. Jerry whimpered and asked if she could really call John Dad. Her brother handed her a napkin and answered in the affirmative, even though she couldn't get her last name back. Jericho cheerfully replied that it was no big deal and she might not change it at all. Jerry thought to settle the matter when she found Mr. Araf's son. The girl didn't understand why they were so kind to her because she had originally come here for money. Jerry wanted to be honest about why she had come, but her uncle interrupted her. He inquired what she had to say. Jericho laid out that she had originally come to them for a cash reward. The brother realized what she meant and said they knew about it, since the story of Jericho's trip had already been reported to them. In their opinion, it was especially cute how Jericho promised to give everyone a treat if she found her birth father. The man reported that the local villagers had already received the reward. Uncle said that after Jericho raised the sword, the original reason for her arrival to them ceased to matter. The only thing that mattered to them was that Araf's own daughter had time to see him off on his last journey. Jericho cried at these words. Her brother said Jerry could see that they weren't such bad people. Her uncle asked her not to cry. Jericho, through her tears, stammered and asked for forgiveness. Her brother asked Jerry not to be upset that John hadn't talked to her about his new job, since she knew her father wasn't going to cheat on her. The man shared that John had told him that he would be at the workshop late tonight. Therefore, he thought they should talk tomorrow. Jericho was hiccuping hard because of her tears, but she was already smiling quite a bit. Her uncle advised her to drink tea. Jerry headed for her chambers. She thought that all the members of Araf-san's family were good people despite their backgrounds. In her opinion, that was one of the reasons why Mr. Araf was able to become a hero. The sword tainted the good impression of the family. It reminded him not to put too much trust in the Arrivo household, since the fact that they had tried to kill Jerry with the sword hadn't gone anywhere. But still, Sword thought that in some ways Jericho was right. They weren't so bad. Sword wondered now if the girl was less afraid of them. Jericho hummed and replied that the words of the sword had refreshed her memory, so she was still afraid of them. The girl decided that even though her father should return late, she wanted to wait for him. The sword thought that despite her fears, her mistress had become calmer, perhaps used to it. Jericho was sitting outside the front gate of the Duchy of Arrivo. The maids were with her, even though it was very late. Jerry advised them to go and rest, for their father was still late and the girls had to get up early in the morning. The maids wanted to stay. The Duchess thought they had better go rest. She reminded them that she had a dragon slayer with her. The maids hesitated. They decided to leave. The girls anxiously asked Jerry not to stay long. Jerry smiled sincerely at this concern and waved her hand. Jerry was more startled by the fact that it was so cozy and warm around her. She warmed her hands against the portable fireplace. Sword asked why it frightened her. Jericho didn't think she deserved that comfort and warmth. Sword muttered that how many times he had to tell her she deserved it, because she was the only one who could hold him. The girl laughed tensely. The embers crackled loudly in the fireplace, giving warmth. Sword asked Jerry to relax. Sword told her to think that he had rented her body and that attitude was payment for her work. Sword said it wasn't a bad job, even though the compensation would be less when you quit. Jerry replied mockingly that she got more money here than she worked. Her interlocutor still disagreed. He asked the girl to answer a few questions. The sword asked if her own mother had died recently. Jerry answered, confused, that she had. The next question surprised Jericho greatly and saddened her. Sword asked how her mom had died. Jerry felt sad. She thought that if she hadn't taken her advice then and there, she wouldn't have gone to the duchy. Then Jericho would probably still be grieving and depressed. Jerry wondered if Mum had thought of that too. The girl remembered the day of her mum's funeral. Jerry told her that she had been very ill and had died next to them. Sword asked her to imagine that at the moment of her death, none of them had been there. but a stranger had taken care of her. Jericho admitted that although it would never happen, she would be grateful to this man. Sword drew the parallel that she was also grateful to the House of Arrivo. The girl laughed in surprise, but the sword comparison warmed her troubled heart a little. Jerry was drinking a delicious tea with honey. Sword asked if she wanted to give it to her father. The girl replied that it was all right, since Dad doesn't like to get very drunk, so he won't need much tea. Sword asked what if John didn't come back today. Jericho was sure that her father would definitely come back. She told her that if things were not work-related, her father always spent the night at home. This was the promise the man had made to his mother. Sword noticed that Jerry didn't doubt her father for a second and believed until the very end, even though they weren't even blood relatives. The sword admitted to itself that although it could not accurately detect other people's emotions, its owner had been so happy when Jericho had lifted it. The girl was his last happiness, and he was a burden to her. Sword reasoned, if Jericho didn't have a family of her own, would she then be happy to know that her master was her birth father? Unexpectedly to Sword, Jericho asked him what he was thinking about. Sword quickly threw back that it was about nothing. Jerry smiled at him and told him that although she couldn't read his thoughts, she could feel his feelings. The girl asked him not to be so sad. Sword chuckled. The girl hugged the sword and held it close to her. She promised to stay by its side until a new master was found. Besides, she thought she was doing a good job as a temporary master. Jerry laughed embarrassedly and got up from the bench. The girl was already drowsy. Sword suggested a walk around the courtyard. Someone was insistently calling Jericho by name, trying to wake her up with it. The girl struggled to open her eyes. It was her father. The man carefully asked if she was all right, if she had been waiting here for a long time. John noticed that it was already very cold outside. The man was worried that the girl must be cold. Jerry assured him that she was fine because she was wearing a plaid. Her father sat down next to her and drank the tea Jerry had made for him. He said warmly that he had a caring daughter. Jericho asked how he was doing with his work. The man shared that he will be out from tomorrow. He will work as a trainee for now, but from next year he will be a full-fledged worker. Jerry was surprised because he was a skilled worker. John replied that the experience he had gained in the village was not enough in the capital. The father looked at his daughter with warmth in his eyes as she mumbled unhappily to herself. John replied that how could he not work when Jerry worked so hard? After all, he knew she was not comfortable being an aristocrat. Jericho shrieked in surprise, for how did he know? The man stroked the girl's head and replied that he was her daddy. He was ready to endure everything for her and the younger ones. Especially here, everyone was very kind. Jericho tensely clutched the plaid that was still on her shoulders. The man asked if she was still uncomfortable in the duchy. The girl threw herself into her father's arms, who immediately hugged her tightly. Jerry said with tears in her eyes that he was the best daddy. The man thought that if things got really tough for Jerry, he should have enough strength that she could rely on him. If John could learn a trade in the capital, it would be very useful. John explained this to his daughter and asked her to think about it. Now there were people to look after Orion and May, and Carrie and Eki could go to school. From now on, the man could take it easy and work hard. And it was all thanks to Jericho. But John asked his daughter, if things got really hard for her, not to put up with absolutely everything just because of them. He said that the responsibility for the family should not fall on her shoulders. The man asked if Jericho had been unwell when she was looking after the younger ones. Jerry hastily replied that she hadn't been in the slightest. John replied that neither did he, and he had never felt uncomfortable that Jerry wasn't his own daughter, and John had never blamed Mr. Araf for that. John shared that he was even surprised when he learnt that the red-haired knight turned out to be Araf. In any case, the man was grateful to him for saving them from the mad dragon. Jerry cried in her father's arms. The man distanced himself a little and looked into Jericho's eyes, which were full of genuine tears. John admitted that he is also grateful to Araf for giving him such a wonderful and beautiful daughter. Her father's words really touched the girl. She repeated again that he was the best for her. The man was glad to hear this, but laughed that Mr. Araf would not be upset. The man smiled warmly. He informed his daughter that it was already time to go back inside the house. Jerry was lying in bed when the sword informed her that she would have a hard time getting married. The girl asked why that was. The sword replied that her birth father was a real hero, and her stepfather was such a good man. The sword thought it would be as if Jerry was out of reach for men. Jerry agreed and chuckled at the fact that she had an intelligent sword beside her, smarter than most. The sword seemed to glow with praise and said that she was telling the truth. The girl covered him with a blanket, laying him on the pillow beside her. Jericho said goodnight to the dragon slayer. He shrieked that he was a sword after all and he didn't need to sleep. The girl fell asleep quickly enough. Sword couldn't believe that the little girl was mistaking him for a teddy bear, as Jerry hugged him in her sleep. Sword thought it was rude to humanity's national treasure. He snorted, for he wanted to grumble, and she fell asleep. The girl sniffled sweetly and peacefully as the sword wished her sweet dreams. The next day, Jericho was uncomfortable before the Empress, but she wanted the sun to rise in the west and set in the east. As she sat before the mirror and the maids were preparing her for tea, Sword informed her that even if a tornado started, the Empress was unlikely to cancel the tea party. He'd rather believe that she'd fall abruptly ill. Jerry said she didn't have to, since it wasn't her fault. When the girl's outfit, hair, and makeup were ready, she examined herself critically in the mirror, which was considerably taller than she was. Jericho thought she looked like a princess of some country. She poked herself on the cheek to see if what she saw in the mirror was real. The girl thought that if she always dressed like this, she would not be famous as a peddler, but as a city beauty. The sword reported that she looked like her master. The sword told her that Araf was very handsome when he was healthy and energetic. Jerry questioned whether it was true and leaned toward the mirror. She asked if they really looked alike. Jericho nodded at the portraits, of which there were many in the house. Sword said he knew what she was thinking. He thought it best not to have Jerry look at these portraits, since only the heroic side of his master was to be portrayed, and there was much exaggeration in them. Sword thought Jericho looked a lot like her father, and if she were a son, she would be accepted even without ID. Jerry was a little uneasy, for how could they be so much alike? The maid entered the room and informed the girl that it was already time to leave for the palace. Jericho quickly walked over to the sword and clutched it anxiously in her hand, as if preparing for defense. When they were already in the carriage, the sword decided to distract Jerry by talking, and asked if she knew that the carriages of the Duchy of Miveo and the imperial carriages had the same characteristics. But it didn't help Jerry. She nervously asked to stop stressing her out. Sword informed her that she mustn't forget that she wasn't some simpleton, and that the imperial family took her seriously. Jericho exhaled heavily and tried to calm herself. She repeated to herself that she was on her way to meet the Empress and the other noble ladies. Jerry reminded herself of Mistress Sylvia's words that she was second in status. She thought that even if she left the Duchy of Miveo in the future, she should show herself in such a way that she would not be spoken of badly. No matter how hard the girl tried to hide her trembling, the maid who accompanied her noticed how badly Jericho was shaking. Jerry opened the carriage window and reiterated that she must keep her cool. The girl tensely told herself that today she was not Jericho Hans, but Jericho Miweo. The sword supported her and told her that she had a great attitude and she could do it. Jericho looked out of the window and shouted loudly that she was the Duchess of Miweo. At the imperial palace, Jerry was met by a servant and escorted to the greenhouse. He told her that they had several greenhouses, all of them large. The man said it was a huge honor to be invited to a winter tea party at the greenhouse. Jerry disagreed. She felt as if she were going to fall off her feet. What honor there was in it. Suddenly the servant stopped, which surprised her. The man bowed and informed her that she would go to the greenhouse without him. Jerry thanked him. The girl looked at the man and asked Sword why the servant hadn't gone inside. Sword assumed that only girls could attend the tea party. Jericho marveled at how huge the hall was, and what beautiful flowers surrounded her as she entered. Not far away in a thicket of plants, the girl thought she saw a piece of a dress. Jericho moved closer and peered out from behind the bushes, but froze, for it turned out not to be a dress. The girl flinched violently when she realized what it was. Jerry swore loudly. In front of the girl, a man was sitting at a small table reading a book. He was sitting under a large umbrella. That man was the third prince, that he didn't even pay attention to her appearance. Jericho bowed to the prince and saluted, thus getting his attention. The man leisurely took off his glasses and noticed that they hadn't seen the girl in a while. The prince's red eyes looked at Jerry with a searching gaze. She realized that this meeting was definitely a trap for the Empress. Magno said he was honored to be able to accompany Jericho. Jerry mentally scolded herself, for she had been told there would be a tea party with other noblewomen, and there was not even a hint of it. Jerry said confusedly that Her Majesty the Empress had invited her to a tea party. Magno said that she had told him to take care of the girl who would arrive today. The girl whimpered and thought that maybe the Empress didn't mean her. The sword sighed heavily and told her that there was no way out. She should sit down and talk to the prince. Jerry sat up fearfully. She might be in awe of the prince if he wasn't her possible brother. Sword remarked that since they were already trapped, it was worth trying to gather as much information as possible to find out if he was the master's son. Jericho looked up fearfully and hesitantly at the prince who sat opposite. She asked herself how a human could look like that. In her opinion, even the descendant of the Senshi fairies looked more human-like. The prince, on the other hand, looked like he could melt in the sunlight. Sword ordered Jerry to take her eyes off the prince, but it was too late. Magno noticed the stare. Sword shouted that she was staring too hard. Jericho immediately tilted her head low and exhaled heavily. She knew the prince didn't like that kind of intrusive stare. Magno's question surprised the girl. The guy asked if she was surprised by his appearance. Jericho straightened up and showed a thumbs up. She blurted out that the guy looked really cool. Magno was still looking melancholically at the girl. Jerry was worried that he didn't like it. She didn't realize maybe she'd said something wrong. Sword suggested she ask Magno if the sunlight was bothering him. Jerry didn't understand why. Sword explained that albinos properly had a hard time tolerating it. Jerry was worried that it was too personal a question. Sword replied that the third prince didn't shine at all in society and lived quietly, so there was nothing to ask him. So he was offering at least something. The girl agreed that there was no choice. Jerry stammered, saying that it was very stuffy today. She wondered if Magno was hot. The third prince replied indifferently that he had an umbrella, so it was fine. Jericho remembered that cool prince's umbrella. When she saw it from afar, she thought it was someone's dress. It appeared that Jerry had spoken her thoughts aloud. The prince expressed his doubts that any of the ladies would wear a black dress, for it was not a funeral. It seemed to the girl that Magno didn't really want to talk to her. Sword nervously remarked that the prince's behavior was disgusting. He surmised, judging from the lad's character, that he was not his master's son. Jericho asked what about looks, if Magno looked like her father. Sword didn't know, for all three went to their mothers. He felt that if someone looked as much like Araf as Jerry did, there would be less of a problem. The girl thought that Rosen looked like his father. But the sword was not so sure. In fact, in his opinion, the boy was similar only in hair color and character, but in appearance, he was a copy of his mother. Sword said that the prince looked frail, so he was unlikely to be able to wield a sword. He laughed that Jericho would be the better of the two of them. Jerry began to cross Sword about Magno's strength, as she remembered how easily the guy had lifted her then. The girl did not notice that she was speaking out loud again. The prince asked her what the last words about lightness meant. Jericho replied that she had noticed last time that he was very strong. She asked if he played any sports. Sword praised her for asking a good question. He figured that if Magno was the master's son, he probably liked sports. The prince shook his head and admitted he wasn't into anything in particular. Sword was nervous, for he thought the prince was lazy. Jerry decided to go on with the topic. The girl said that she was very strong, because she could easily lift all of the girls in the village. Magno wondered and asked how she was able to lift 200 kilos. Such a weight dumbfounded the girl. Jerry had a mute shock, for in her village the largest individual weighed a maximum of 80 kilograms. Jericho nervously wondered if piglets looked different in the Empire. Magno pictured a much larger pig and replied that apparently it was. The prince concluded that in Jerry's homeland the pigs were small. Jericho remarked that the prince knew their exact weight. The girl complimented the boy that he was very clever. Magno pointed to a book titled, A Study of Diet-Dependent Lizard Variability in the Huff Mountain Range. Jerry was impressed. The book looked hard to read. She confessed that she had been studying the alphabet of the nobility lately to get into the academy. Between words, the girl shared that she had heard that Magno was studying at Luna Academy. He replied that he specialized in finance. Princess Lily also works in the Treasury Department. She and her son have the same speciality. In the girl's opinion, the boy looked like his mother, but there was also some sad beauty in him. Jerry asked Sword if she thought it was because of the color of the guy's skin. The Sword added that Magno was still very secretive. This puzzled the girl. She asked the Sword if the prince was secretive because of his family. But the Sword stopped answering the girl's question for some reason. Jericho didn't understand why it was suddenly silent. Magno asked what major Jericho had chosen. Jerry distracted herself from the silence of the Sword and replied that humanities. The prince replied that it wasn't a bad direction, if she hadn't decided on the right subject yet. He asked what she thought about fencing. Jerry replied that she had only recently picked up a sword for the first time. Magno said she didn't bring the sword today. The girl reached for the blade and replied that here was the sword. Jericho placed the sword on the table in front of Magno and reported that the weight was the same, but it turned out that the sword could change shape. Magno watched as the sword changed again. He whispered that it was a feature of a distinguished sword capable of slaying a dragon. Jericho remarked that the sword was incredible. Magno cautioned the girl not to tell anyone about the details of her sword, as someone could take advantage of it. Sword grumbled that very helpful admonition, and he was about to cry. Jerry asked the sword to stop hating the prince so much, because what if he turned out to be his new master? Jerry answered Magno that she hadn't even thought about it and would be more careful from now on. The prince warned her that there were people who were hostile to her. Sword muttered that it was the abnormal aristocrats and the slightly abnormal commoners who might already have a grudge against her. Jericho believed that if they wanted to kill her, they were no longer slightly insane. Magno informed her that the thing Jerry should fear the most was dragons. The girl froze. The girl looked fearfully at the prince and asked in a hoarse voice if she had understood him correctly. Jericho didn't understand why dragons would hunt her. The prince looked indifferently at Jerry's face. The prince explained that with Jericho's death, the only person capable of wielding a dragon slayer would disappear. The girl's heart thundered in her chest. Jericho realized the truth of the prince's words. There was only one question in the girl's mind, whether the dragons really wanted to kill her. Jerry immediately turned to the sword. It was important for her to hear what he thought of the prince's words and how much of it was realizable. After her questions, the girl felt waves of guilt and sadness that emanated from the sword that was silent. Jericho tearfully asked His Highness if the dragons were really after her already. Magno replied that he couldn't say for sure, but the guy reported that dragons are very proud creatures, and the fact that a human attacked and killed their kin with a sword that can kill dragons. In his opinion, that fact might have made them feel furious. Magno said that at least if he were a dragon, he wouldn't just let it go. The girl nervously protested, for perhaps they would leave her alone. Magno replied that it was possible, and some dragons would. After these words, the young man stopped talking and watched Jerry's reaction. The young man was silent for a moment and watched Jerry's reaction. The guy said still most people were unlikely to agree to that. Jericho jumped up from her chair and shouted loudly the question of what she should do now. Magno said that fortunately, dragons live forever and their concept of time is very different from humans. So he thought that maybe Jerry's life would be over before the dragons decided to do anything. Jericho flopped back into her chair with hasty relief. She realized that if she died and her children were alive, the dragons might well decide to spring into action. Then her children would die. Jerry got abruptly to her feet again and shouted that she didn't want it that way. The prince said that it wouldn't necessarily happen now, as it might be hundreds or even thousands of years from now. Jericho blurted out that she still felt sorry for them. Magno looked at the girl carefully and his eyes glittered strangely. The young man slowly got to his feet, resting his hand on the table. He told Jerry that there was one solution to this problem. Magno came closer to her and told her that dragons don't like unnecessary work. He said that if Jerry had a lot of offspring, it would take longer to slay them. So, in the prince's opinion, to create extra work for the dragons, Jerry should produce as many children as possible. Jerry froze at his words. The boy, meanwhile, touched her chin and lifted her face. The third prince whispered a quiet yes to the girl's question, for he was already leaning almost close to Jericho's face. Jerry froze as if spellbound. Magno whispered that she needed so many children that the dragons would be too lazy to kill them. He informed her that the girl could do it with him. Jericho stared in horror at the third prince's face that was so close to her. She couldn't believe his words. The girl didn't know what to say to the prince and was trembling. Jericho asked the dragon slayer to help her. But the sword was silent. Jerry couldn't take her eyes off Magno's. The prince offered to tell her what kind of spouse she wanted, and he would be it. He suggested that it would not be possible to be sweet and affectionate at once, but if there were more wishes. The third prince's lips were as close as possible to Jericho's ajar lips. She wondered if she should go along with it. But the thought flashed through Jerry's muddled mind that the prince might be her own brother. The thought sobered her, and she pushed the prince away with a shout that she couldn't do that. The prince didn't immediately move the proper distance away from Jericho after the rejection. so he felt how much she was shaking. Magno apologized for his rudeness. Jerry looked at him with tear-filled eyes and said it was all right. Jericho hysterically blurted out that she wanted to be friends with the prince, but that wasn't her thing. She shouted hysterically that she wanted to be friends with the prince, but it wasn't for her. The girl hid her face in her palms. She could hardly breathe and her face was burning. Jerry told the dragon slayer that it was all because of him, but he didn't say a word. Jerry shouted to the sword that she almost kissed her possible brother. She begged him to say something. The sword said that perhaps Magno was the master's son, for he had so skillfully approached and charmed her, a capable lad. The third prince began to pull something out of the inner pocket of his camisole. The young man apologized for Jerry's great fright, for he had been too assertive with the young duchess. He handed her a handkerchief. Jericho snatched the handkerchief sharply from the prince's hands and glared angrily at him, much to the lad's surprise. Sword pronounced himself proud of Jerry, for how they had become friends. She even blows her nose in the prince's handkerchief. Jericho asked unhappily if that was all he had to say to her. After all, if just a little longer she dragged on, trouble might have happened. Jerry looked at the imperturbable prince. The sword reminded her that Magno was only 2 years older than Jerry. The girl thought that meant he was only 19, and he was already so skillful at charming girls. Jerry asked the sword what would happen when Magno grew up. The sword reminded her that the prince had already grown up. The girl was more frightened that she was beginning to regret the unfulfilled kiss. Magno saw what a mixed state the girl was in. He apologized because it was too sudden. Jerry said through a whimper that she wanted a real relationship, not a marriage of convenience. Magno recalled his words about being able to adjust. Jerry was outraged since he didn't have genuine feelings for her. The guy replied that he could pretend all his life that he didn't. Jericho asked if the idea to glamour her belonged to the emperor and empress. Magno shook his head in the negative. He said that the empress had simply asked him to take care of her, and he had interpreted it in his own way. Magno confessed that they do wish for their marriage. Jericho was surprised to notice that the prince was acting strangely. Jerry asked if they would agree to have the prince marry a girl he didn't like. Magno melancholically replied that if they so desired, he would pretend to be in love. The girl began to ask the prince what he wanted. Magno repeated that he would do whatever the emperor and empress wanted. Jericho resented that it wouldn't make Magno happy, would it? The prince said that he was happy when they were happy. The girl shrieked loudly and grudgingly that this was absurd. Her shriek made the young man flinch and raise his gaze to her face. Jerry assured that usually parents are happy when their child is happy. The girl said that she had the feeling during the reception that the parents loved him very much. The girl didn't understand how they could agree for him to marry someone he didn't even like. Jerry's next question made the prince recoil from her. She asked if it would bring them happiness. Jericho began to berate herself for saying that. After all, Mrs. Sylvia had often asked her not to talk about Magno's parents. The girl clenched her teeth angrily. She didn't understand what was happening and was extremely indignant. Jericho looked at the prince again with tears in her eyes and said that he already knew that her whole life her father had been another man for her. Jerry shared that she always tries to do what Daddy asks, but she will never do anything she doesn't like. After all, if she follows his words like a puppet, Daddy will be sad. She noticed that although they had only dined with them once then, she had felt quite definitely in harmony then. Jerry noticed the warm glances of the emperor and empress that were directed at Magno. The girl compared them with her father John's. Jericho supposed that if they knew what the prince was really thinking, they would be sad. The girl told the prince frankly that his actions lacked his own desire. She asked if he really thought they would like it if Magno married her. Jericho thought not, and expressed this to the prince. She told Magno that negligence of oneself is disrespect for one's parents. The girl fearfully slammed her mouth shut and covered her palms with her hands. She didn't understand why she'd done all this. Jerry realized that she had overdone it with her words and wanted to explain herself, but she didn't have time. The third prince calmly and grudgingly informed the girl that he had been mistaken. Magno pronounced that, as Jericho had said, their origins were indeed similar. The boy took his book in his hands and stood up. He said that was the reason he hoped they could be friends. Magno added that he was deluded. He opened his umbrella and prepared to leave Jericho. The young man said goodbye to the girl and left, leaving her alone. Jericho stared at him blankly. Jericho shared with the sword deep in the night at the manor that she was more worried about the prince scolding her, for the reason that Magno had a very angry face. Sword replied that even among aristocrats the third prince was special, standing out for his character. Jerry smiled back, for Rosen was easier for her to talk to. She heard only silence in response to her words, the sword unresponsive. Jericho lay face down in the pillow on her bed. Jerry asked the sword why he had stopped talking again. He replied that he had realized his stupidity and decided to talk less. Sword berated himself for not thinking at all about the fact that dragons could also be dangerous to the girl. He thought he was unworthy to give Jericho advice. Jerry shrieked that he was still 100 times smarter than she was. She asked him to stop talking and say something. Sword asked her to stop lashing out at him and rather tell him what she thought of the prince. The girl stared pensively at the ceiling. Jericho replied that she didn't know specifically, but Magno clearly had an injury, and for some reason she felt like she should be the one to heal it. Sword didn't quite know what she was talking about, but maybe it made sense. Jerry said that from the way the prince talks about his parents, he's not a bad person. Sword suggested that it didn't seem to her as if Magno was very hung up on being adopted. The girl cried out sharply and turned back to the sword. She said she had thought of something while she was at the tea party. Jerry said that when Magno lifted her up to put her in the carriage, he didn't catch fire. She asked if the prince was really Mr. Araf's son. The sword said that Jerry was holding it then. She replied that he had said himself that you could catch fire even if you lifted the table on which you put it. Sword asked if it was a table. Jerry mumbled heavily. She couldn't take it anymore. She yelled that she would now spend several sleepless nights because of Magno's face. Jericho asked how one could be so handsome. The girl covered her face with her hands and suffered. She waited for the sword's reaction to her words. But there was no response. Jerry looked at the sword indignantly and noticed that it was silent again. The sword replied that it had gone into introspection mode, so it would be silent for the time being. Jerry took his hands in hers and began to twist round the bed. She began to beg him to keep quiet. It seemed to her, after all, that Magno was not Mr. Araf's son, since there was no point in Princess Lily hiding him. In her opinion, even the opposite, because it's cool when the husband is a folk hero. Sword said that the princess was in favor of celibacy and did not want to marry, much less leave the imperial palace. Sword explained that the princess was never even interested in a relationship, so everyone was very surprised when they saw her pregnant. Jerry didn't know about it. Jericho decided to arrange all the events by time in a notebook. Mr. Araf worked as a soldier, met platinum stars, then Rosen was born. Jerry asked if the man had become a master swordsman after breaking up with her. Sword replied that it seemed so. Jerry asked who was next to be born, the Senshi or the prince. Sword mumbled that it was Senshi. The sword began to reconstruct the events and reported that the master had become a sword master, after which he received a commission from the emperor. Afterwards, he returned to the capital. It was in the capital that Araf met with the head of the magic tower, and before he went to the dragon, he met Princess Lily. Jericho gave an interested gasp and said that was how it was. The girl liked to hear about amorous affairs. According to Jerry's calculations, there is an empty gap of 2 years between Magno and her. She asked the sword what her father was doing then. The sword replied that before the battle with the dragon, the master had gone on one last journey to sort himself out. Jerry asked that the man wasn't sure he would win. The sword explained that wasn't the point. He confessed that his master thought he was going to die in that battle. Tears welled up in Jerry's eyes and she whimpered. She said that even if he wasn't her father, she would still be sad about the story. On his last journey, Araf stopped by a long-ago village, slayed the monsters there, and appropriately met Jericho's mum there. She wrote in the blank space that there was a she and her mum, Yona. Jerry thought it was strange to write her mum's name in aristocratic letters. Jericho smiled at her thoughts and decided to write down her mum's name in regular letters. Suddenly something clicked in the girl's head, and she decided to ask the sword about Princess Lily. Jerry assumed that the woman was hiding the fact that Magno was Mr. Araf's son, lest he become a pretender to the throne and unrest ensue. Sword replied that it was unlikely, since in the current times one does not become emperor simply because one is a hero. Jericho was indignant because they risked their lives, and that was an injustice. Though Jerry assumed that if Mr. Araf were the emperor, she would be even more worried. Sword said frankly that he didn't know anything about the prince or Princess Lily. Sword reported that the master had been traveling when Magno was born, and when he returned to the capital, all was quiet. Even in the past, it was hard to find information about the imperial family. Jerry countered that there was a lot of information about platinum and Rosen in newspapers and magazines. Jericho resented that it was all very complicated. She asked the sword to tell how her father had met the princess. The sword was silent, so the girl took it in her hands and began to wave it. She repeated grudgingly for him to tell. Jericho pressed the sword with requests. A gleam started in her eyes, for the girl realized that the story was going to be interesting. Jerry moved the sword closer to his face and stared at it closely. The sword surrendered and began its story. One man made his name famous throughout the world through tireless effort and great talent, and he decided that this power should be channeled for the benefit of people. One day, the emperor summoned a man and asked, "Will you not subdue the demons and the mad dragon that take human lives?" The man obediently replied, "If by doing so people can be happy." The great hero agreed to sacrifice his life and fight the mad dragon. That fateful night, someone knocked on the hero's room. The unexpected guest was at the door. This guest turned out to be the princess, who was then wearing only a thin robe. The man was surprised at the visit of the princess, who was usually cold in nature. The man asked Her Highness what was wrong. The woman replied, "That's all I can do for a great hero willing to sacrifice his own life for the happiness of the people." Jericho began to strain her memory, for she had heard something like this somewhere. The hero replied, "Your Highness, you don't have to. Do it with the person you love." The princess replied, "I love you. This may be our last meeting. Please give me these memories." The princess threw off her robe, exposing her beautiful body, and the only thing that covered it was her long hair. Jericho grudgingly eyed, for she remembered. She asked, so it was Princess Lily. The girl took the sword in her hands and asked him to wait, for she was getting déjà vu from his story. Jerry continued his story herself. The princess, as if from embarrassment, leaned her head against the hero's chest, and he, stroking her curls little by little. Sword stammered, surprised and tense, asking the girl how she knew this. Sword asked if Jericho had learnt to predict. Jerry didn't know how to answer him. Jerry replied that there is a popular novel called The Mysterious Night of the Princess and the Knight. It tells about a princess who was in love with a knight. In the story, they spent the night together. Time passed, and returning from his mission, the knight married her. Sword replied that it was a little similar. Jericho assured him that it wasn't a little, since even the lines are the same. Sword shrieked indignantly that there could be no such thing. Jerry said she remembered that for sure, for he could read her mind. Jerry said the novel was for adults, so the children read it secretly. And the moment where they spend the night was reread several times. The sword frowned, for it appeared that his master had deceived him. Jerry replied that maybe not. She thought it was easier for him to tell his story in the style of the novel. Jerry rather pointed out that they didn't know for sure anyway, so she asked to hear about the head of the magic tower. Sword agreed. The emperor gathered the best craftsmen to create a weapon to slay the mad dragon. They included the head of the magic tower. The woman, seeing the swordmaster, who was her complete opposite, began to show interest in him. Jericho hummed and said, albeit trivial, but it sounded like the truth. The sword replied indignantly that that was what it was about, for the master could not have lied. Jerry replied that he might have exaggerated, for she too sometimes embellished stories to make them more interesting for the younger ones to hear. Jericho asked the sword to wait, and with a sly face asked if it was possible that the story of the sons was also an exaggeration. Sword shrieked indignantly that it wasn't, since his master had told him for sure that one of those three was his son. Jericho laughed and said that in her opinion it was definitely not Prince Magno. Jerry continued to laugh as she said that the story with Princess Lily wasn't good, and her grade was a 3. Sword shook with displeasure. Jerry added that it was only because both characters were handsome. Jericho sighed and thought she shouldn't have said no then. I mean, when will she ever get a chance to kiss a man like that again? Jericho began to run her finger embarrassedly along the bedspread near the sword. She asked what he thought would be her opportunity. But the sword was thinking of its own. It twitched indignantly and began to ask if she thought the master himself had lied to him. He said there was no such thing. Therefore, the prince should be returned to the candidates. Jericho said, laughing, that he might not have lied about his sons, but he had exaggerated the love story. The sword shook with indignation. Jericho started laughing even louder and told the sword that he should stop believing everything. He was so gullible that Jerry couldn't stop. The next day, the sword muttered unhappily that his master had lied to him. Jericho hadn't expected such a long worry and asked him to calm down. Jerry told the sad sword that the master hadn't lied to him about everything. just embellished his stories a little. The sword said he was so proud, thinking he knew everything. He thought he was stupid. The girl told him that he was a sword that could kill dragons and set people on fire, and that he could talk and was much smarter than she was. The sword mumbled that he wasn't smart at all, because he'd been in a closed room for 17 years, like a frog in a swamp. The sword completely wilted and became a junior. Jerry wondered if he was in his mid-teens by any chance. She wondered how to cheer him up. Jericho remembered his words about how, after all, he was a sword and needed a strong master. The girl went to her cousin with some idea, but heard something that didn't make her happy. The man said they didn't have a training ground. Jerry cried out in surprise. Jerry was puzzled how the house the swordmaster was born in didn't have a place to train. Her brother replied that her uncle had a private training ground, but when he'd had a fight with the last duke, it had been torn down. Jericho asked how they didn't have another site. The man repeated that she didn't seem to understand his words. Her brother had told her with a serious face that the Duchy of Arrivo belonged to a generation of scholars. Jerry remembered that the duke hardly ever left his office. The man said that Uncle Araf was a late and special son. He still could not understand what kind of elixir Grandpa drank that the ladies wrote to him in his old age. Jerry understood now how the 70-year-old grandfather had conceived a son. Jerry asked if there was a suitable place to practice with the sword. It just seemed to her that the dragon slayer needed to unwind a little. Her brother stared at her unhappily. But then he suggested that perhaps a garden would be appropriate. Jericho went straight to the garden and started swinging her sword. Jerry asked if Sword was feeling better, if he was feeling better. Sword wasn't happy and asked the girl to just go back to the room. Jericho was very upset because it didn't work out. She said they should find another way to go out. The girl came to the younger ones and asked them what they thought the sword might like. One answered that a handsome master, the other that a beautiful scabbard, and the youngest sister, May, shouted blood. Jericho started calling out loudly and indignantly to the little girl, who was already running away from them and laughing loudly. The girl went to her father, but he didn't know either. The man had never asked himself that question. The man asked his daughter if he should ask the blacksmiths in town about it. Jericho was pleased at the idea. My father shared that he was going to look at the new job site tomorrow, and there would be several gun shops nearby. He offered to go together. Jerry couldn't believe her happiness that she could go to work with him. The man replied that she was an adult and could go with him. She wouldn't get into trouble. Jerry thought that the main thing was to make sure that no one who might recognize her did. Jericho thought that traveling to her father's work in a carriage, accompanied by servants, was not a good idea. So the girl came up with some idea that will help her to hide in the city amongst a large crowd of people. After all, it was the Duchess of Mavoy who was in danger, not a country maiden. So the girl found the necessary items and dressed herself in them. Her cousin shared with her that the sword had defense magic placed on it. In addition, when the dragon slayer awakened, a mage from the imperial palace had put tracking magic on it. So wherever Jericho is, she'll be safe next to the dragon slayer. Jericho offered the sword a walk. He first suggested that she go for a walk alone, but then he changed his mind. It could be dangerous. Sword wondered where she was dressed up like that. The girl grudgingly asked how he could notice her appearance only now. Jerry asked Sword to get ready. Jericho solemnly informed the sword that it was time to move out, and he would see for himself next. Jerry was happy to walk with her father under her arm. Her father noticed that she was happy. Passers-by in town noticed how cute John's daughter was. John informed Jerry that the alley they came to was full of gun shops. He was finishing at 6 and asked her to be back by then. Jerry saluted in military fashion and agreed. The girl quickly went about her business. She wanted to find a blacksmith who knew how to sense swords. Jericho cheerfully asked the dragon slayer to look around. Sword didn't realize what was happening or where they were. Sword noticed that they had come to the armory. He asked indignantly if she had decided to trade him for another sword. Jerry was surprised and asked if he was crazy. The sword started shouting how she can choose other swords when she has him, since he is the only one capable of changing his appearance and chatting with her. Sword was shaking in frustration. Jerry asked him to calm down. The sword demanded the girl to explain what was missing in it. He shouted that he was the only sword that could cut down dragons and belonged to the hero that had saved mankind. Sword surmised that did she really want to leave him because she was afraid of dying? He asked her not to do that. Jerry noticed the other's attention to her and the shaking sword. She decided to get out of there. The girl walked into the nearest establishment. It had a huge fireplace. The fireplace had a huge fireplace, and the burning logs were crackling loudly. Jerry explained to the sword that she wasn't going to leave him. On the contrary, she wanted to cheer him up, so she decided to go for a walk. Sword asked how he would be cheered up if she was hanging around the workshops. Jericho asked what the problem was, since his friends were there, albeit non-speaking. The sword muttered that they were rivals. Jerry was surprised that he thought the other swords were his rivals. Jerry touched the hilt of the sword with her cap visor tiredly. She sighed and said she understood and wouldn't buy anything. The sword jealously muttered for her not to touch any other swords, even if the seller offered. Jerry asked cheerfully if he wanted something to do. Sword wanted to go on a trip. Jerry didn't understand him and asked him again. He offered to go on a free journey. Since he was unable to move on his own, he needed a master with whom he could go traveling. But he had screwed up. Sword thought he was very stupid and chastised himself for not even thinking about the threat from the dragons. Jericho asked the dragon slayer to stop blaming himself. She promised him that she would hand him over to his new master and give him his freedom back. Jerry shouted at the whole place that she needed him, and she couldn't do it without him. People began to turn round at the shouting. Sword apologized for his slip of the tongue and thanked the girl. The girl started hugging the sword and assured that everything was fine. An employee of the establishment approached the girl and asked her to leave the establishment. Jerry ran merrily down the paving stones of the street. Sword resented being kicked out. Jerry replied cheerfully that the important thing was that he was cheerful. Sword asked why she'd put so much stuff in her bag and why she had the owner's ID. Jerry answered that it was a habit to carry it, and that it was just in case something happened. It would be possible to exchange it for money. Jerry walked up to the armory again. Sword asked indignantly why she was going there again. Jerry replied that she wanted to buy daggers as a present for Carrie and Eka for next year. Jericho told me that in their village, when a child grows up, they are given a knife. Carrie inherited it. The girl stopped abruptly at the entrance to the armory on her run, as she noticed something or someone inside. In the workshop, Rosen was standing near the counter. The guy was chatting with the gunsmith. Jerry noticed that they were always meeting him. It was like magic. Sword thought that was great and suggested that Jerry talk to him. Jericho replied that she was here today as Hans. The girl noticed that everyone was already peeking at Rosen, and if she came over, they'd start staring at her. Sword acknowledged Jerry's point. Jericho was hiding behind a nearby locker and suggested to the sword that she simply walk away unnoticed. A little while later, the girl was holding a bag of knives. She praised herself for she had received a scabbard as a gift, a very favorable one. The girl offered cheerfully to buy something for the sword. Jerry asked what he wanted. The sword replied that he wanted decorative jewelry. Jerry suggested some brightly colored ones to make it pretty. Suddenly, the sword began shouting loudly for Jericho to stop. He shouted for her to look into the shop on the left. Jericho didn't immediately realize what the sword wanted her to do, so she froze in surprise, then turned her head in that direction. So in the large window of some potions and vials counter, Senshi stood and chatted with the vendor. Jericho gasped loudly when she saw the young man. Sword sighed loudly, for they had almost missed him. Jerry touched the sword and happily complimented that it was simply the best. It turned out that this shop sold magical goods. Sword noticed that Senshi was about to leave. The boy pulled the hood of his robe up to go unnoticed as he walked out the door, but Jerry was already waiting for him. Jericho greeted the guy cheerfully and said that they had met before, hadn't they? Senshi froze fearfully. Senshi was greatly startled by the girl's words and began to thrash awkwardly near the door. Jericho froze in bewilderment. The boy started to run away, but Jerry caught him by the edge of his robe. She shouted that they needed to talk. Senshi twitched and shouted exasperatedly that he wasn't buying, didn't believe, and didn't need anything. Jerry didn't know what he meant. Senshi shouted that there were only 3 reasons for unknown girls to talk to him. 1. Received orders from a witch. 2. Selling organs. 3. Engaging in pseudo-religion. The girl was indignant for how this guy still didn't recognize her. Senshi interpreted her confusion in his own way and shouted that he knew it was the witch's order. The boy was doing his best to tear the edge of the robe from the girl's hands. Jerry was surprised he was so weak. Senshi said tiredly. He was so hungry he had no more energy. The boy slid to the ground and lay down. Jerry didn't understand how he walked around in such expensive clothes and no money for food. Jerry asked him to come to his senses and told him that they had really seen each other before. Senshi turned around and looked at her. He recognized her, saying it was that beautiful girl. The guy hadn't forgotten what he called her. The girl asked grudgingly if he wanted lunch, promising to pay. Senshi wrapped his head round, for she had offered to have lunch with her. Jerry patiently replied that she just had a couple of questions, and let Oh think that would be his payment for the meal. Senshi looked at her incredulously. The boy mumbled shyly that he should look for a place where there weren't too many people. Jerry looked up at the sky and thought how fussy he was. They found the right place. The boy ordered food as if it were not for one, but for a horde. Jerry asked if he was sure he could eat it all. Senshi pulled his plate of sandwiches towards him and shouted indignantly that if he stayed, he'd take it with him. The boy began to chew everything very quickly and contentedly. Jerry noted skeptically that he had a voracious appetite. Judging by the fact that he'd decided to take the food with him, he was in trouble. Jericho exhaled and decided it was worth it for the answers. The boy glanced up to see that all the food was there. He hoped the waitress wouldn't approach again. Senshi took off his hood and muttered that if he didn't, the waitress would fall in love with him, and that would be unacceptable. Jerry sighed because he was at it again. Jerry asked the Mecha's opinion if Senshi was really starving. She noticed that he was thin and pale. The sword replied that why would he be hungry, rather he doesn't eat. Jericho resented how one could live without food. The swordsman's reply struck Jericho deeply. He said that there were people who sometimes forgot to eat when they were working. Jerry didn't understand at all how that was possible. Jerry tensely asked why Senshi hadn't eaten before. The boy chewed a bun and replied that he had been lazy. The girl couldn't believe it was as the sword said. She thought it couldn't be. That they were blood-related to him. Just impossible. Sword suggested that she shouldn't judge people by their appetite. Jericho grudgingly told Senshi that he looked like he had been malnourished for a week. Senshi replied that it was hard to eat a full meal when traveling, and he had been on bread, water, and sugar for a week. The boy's hand suddenly froze in midair as he reached for the sandwich. He asked how Jerry knew he'd been malnourished for a week. The boy shrieked fearfully that she was definitely following him. Jericho shouted at him nervously that she wasn't, because she had nothing better to do. Senshi relaxed and continued eating. He wondered if that meant it wasn't the witch's orders. The boy assumed that whatever she was, it was unlikely she would have sent the Duchess. Jericho didn't realize what witch, what order, tracking. She asked the sword what Senshi was even talking about. The sword had no idea. The girl decided to ask directly. She asked Senshi what witch's order he was talking about and who she was. Senshi replied that the witch had set a reward for his future children, namely a patent on magic for each. Jerry sighed in surprise. And that witch is the boyfriend's own mother, the head of the magic tower. Senshi said this in a completely casual voice. Jericho stared dumbfounded at the guy. Now she had even more questions. The girl tried to realize the fact that the head of the magic tower was that witch. Sword asked why she would do such a thing. Jerry flinched and asked Senshi why his mum would give such an order. The boy replied that the witch wanted him to have as many offspring as possible. The guy clenched his hand into a fist angrily and stated that he didn't want that. Senshi said that he wanted a peaceful relationship with his favorite woman. Jerry asked him to explain normally, otherwise it was not clear. Senshi explained that he was a half-breed, and the witch had been using his blood since he was a child to conduct experiments to enhance her magic. Jericho cried out in surprise at such horrifying news. It was as if the girl had been struck by lightning. The boy surmised that the witch had apparently had enough of experimenting with his blood, and had now decided to take on his offspring. Shock read on the girl's face. Jericho asked if his mum wanted to start human trafficking. The boy replied that of course not. As alimony, his mother will issue a patent for magic. According to the witch, it was all legal, though it took a bit of work. That's why unmarried girls his age were a bit of a problem. Jericho asked what else the magic patent was for people it might be useful. Senshi replied that the witch develops the magic herself, after which she registers the patent and receives a commission on it. A term of up to 20 years for the patentee. Gary asked if she had registered many patents. The guy replied that yes, because she had invented the magic of paternity determination when she moved to the continent. She was able to make a lot of money because of it. Jerry excitedly perked up and shouted that she had heard of her. Jericho immediately asked if this magic could identify a sibling. The boy answered firmly that it could not. Jerry slapped her face and whined why. Senshi asked her why she was so upset. Senshi started telling her again not to fall in love with him anyway, because he was telling her everything in detail. Jerry whimpered that she wasn't going to. The girl asked if it would be possible to create magic that would determine siblingship. Senshi thought about it and answered that it could be possible if you set the settings for determining siblings. Jericho was already excited and wanted to ask him, but the guy interrupted her, realizing what she meant. Senshi asked if she thought the witch would just let it go. The witch would file a complaint.